The Pacific Ocean does not care about the end of wars. It doesn't care about the men who fought them. It doesn't care what they sacrificed, what they buried, or what they carried home in their chests like shrapnel that never fully healed. It rolls in the same way it always has. Slow, indifferent, ancient, spreading white foam across wet sand the way it has for millions of years before any of them were born, and will for millions more after they're gone, which is exactly why Dante Toretto had chosen this beach. He needed something bigger than himself right now. He needed to feel small. The two cars sat side by side on the packed sand near the waterline, their engines ticking and cooling in the warm California afternoon. Dom's rebuilt 1968 Dodge Charger, 2,000 horsepower of brushed aluminum muscle that looked like something assembled from pure American anger, sat 6 feet from Brian O'Connor's white Nissan Skyline GTR R34. Arctic pearl finish, the same color it had always been. The same car that had been everywhere with Brian across 17 years of impossible situations, rebuilt so many times it had become less a vehicle and more a philosophy. They'd left the crew back at the neighborhood. Mia, Letty, Tej, Roman. The whole extended, chaotic, beautiful wreckage of people that somehow called themselves a family. The goodbyes had been handshakes and pulled bodies and too many emotions for two proud men to name out loud. And now it was just the two of them. The way it always ended up. Dom stood at the waterline with his massive arms folded across his chest, staring at the horizon. The kind of stillness he carried wasn't peace. It was something more complicated than that. It was the stillness of a man whose nervous system had simply processed so many impossible situations that it had stopped registering ordinary threats. The stillness of a man who had buried too many people and was trying, right now, for the first time in a long time, to set that weight down. He was thinking about his father. He was thinking about Jesse. He was thinking about Giselle and how Han had gone quiet in a way that never fully healed. He was thinking about Elena and the impossible choice that had been made for him in Cuba. He was thinking about his son, little Brian, named for the man standing 20 feet behind him, a boy Dom had only learned about when Cipher had shown him the video, a boy whose existence had been leverage, had been a weapon, had been the thing that turned Dom into someone his family couldn't recognize. That was 2 years ago now. 2 years since Cuba. 2 years since Cipher had forced him to betray everything he believed in. 2 years since the crew had fought a submarine on Russian ice and won. 2 years since they'd gotten Elena back alive. Cipher was gone, her network dismantled, her leverage broken. And Dom had thought, genuinely thought, that meant it was over. Brian was already in his car. That was the plan. That had always been the plan. Dom had watched the skyline pull away from the curb 10 minutes ago, had watched that Arctic pearl white shrink in his peripheral vision, growing smaller, becoming just another car on the Pacific Coast Highway until the skyline stopped. Dom turned. Brian sat behind the wheel without moving, engine still running. Through the windshield, Dom could see the side of his face, that jaw working the way it always did when Brian O'Connor was running math in his head. Not regular math. The kind of math that turned the world upside down and left everything looking slightly different afterward. Then the car rolled backward, slowly, deliberately, until it was parked beside the Charger again. Brian stepped out. Gray t-shirt, dark jeans, the worn leather bracelet he'd had for years. He didn't look like a man who had just survived a submarine battle in a war against the world's most dangerous cyber terrorist. He looked like a man who had been sitting on something for hours and had finally decided he was done sitting on it. He was carrying a tablet. Dom watched him cross the sand. Something in Brian's posture, the slight set of his shoulders, the pace that was too deliberate to be casual, sent a quiet, familiar signal through Dom's chest. Not alarm, recognition. Something was wrong. "I thought we said goodbye," Dom said. "We did," Brian said. He held up the tablet. "Then I checked something I've been monitoring." Dom looked at the screen. The image was grainy. Satellite thermal imaging, time-stamped 72 hours prior. It showed the exterior of a building in East Los Angeles. Dom recognized it immediately. The safe house. The one where Elena and little Brian were staying. The arrangement they'd built after everything in Russia, after they'd all agreed that some distance, some protection, was necessary until the threats stopped circling. Inside the building, 2 heat signatures, one adult, one very small, And in the top right corner of the frame, stamped in the clean, impersonal font that government surveillance systems used for everything, a notation that felt like a fist closing around something important. Surveillance asset. Confirmed. Origin. Unknown. Dom's eyes went still. Not his jaw, not his hands. His eyes, the way they went completely, unnervingly flat when something triggered the part of him that operated below emotion, the part made entirely of consequence. "Someone's been watching them," he said. "Not a question." "For at least 3 weeks," Brian corrected. He swiped to the next image. DSS intercept. Encrypted packet, routed through multiple proxy servers across 6 countries. He paused, and when he continued, his voice had dropped into that register it went when he was being fully precise. "Dom, I've seen this routing signature before." "Where?" "First was during the Owen Shaw operation in London." Brian's eyes stayed level. "Second was during Cipher's operation, when she was acquiring God's Eye intelligence, when she was building her leverage architecture." Dom looked up from the tablet. Something moved behind his eyes. "Same methodology," Brian said quietly. "Different tools. Same operational thinking." The ocean kept rolling in behind them. A couple walked a dog somewhere down the beach. A child flew a kite against the blue sky. The whole indifferent pageant of ordinary California life moved around the two of them as if nothing was happening, completely unaware of the conversation at the waterline. Dom took the tablet back. He stared at the thermal image, those 2 signatures inside the walls of a place that was supposed to be secret, and he stayed with it for a long time. Not processing. He had already processed it. He was doing something different. He was accepting it. "We stopped Cipher," Dom said. "We dismantled her network," Brian corrected. "But someone learned from her methods. Someone's been watching, studying how she operated, and they're using the same architecture." He paused. "And they've already found your son." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before it. Before it had been the silence of 2 men setting something down. This was the silence of 2 men picking something back up. "If we retire," Brian said, "we're soft targets. No intelligence, no active surveillance, no agency access. We go dark, we go blind. And blind targets," he let the sentence finish itself. Dom set the tablet down on the Charger's hood. He turned back to the water. For just a moment, one unguarded moment, something crossed his face that was almost unbearable to look at. The grief of a man who had wanted something simple. Barbecues and engine grease and the sound of his family laughing in the next room. A life where the wars stayed in the past where they belonged. He had earned that. By any fair accounting, he had earned it 10 times over. Then the moment passed, and Dom Toretto, who had never once in his life let what he wanted override what needed to be done, turned back from the ocean. "What do you need?" he said. Brian O'Connor, FBI trained, DSS cleared, the most tactically gifted operative to ever disguise himself as a street racer, allowed himself a single, controlled exhale. "I need you to trust me one more time," he said. Dom looked at him. Something in the set of his jaw shifted. "One more time" was over a decade ago, Brian. A beat of silence. "I just need you to keep trusting me," Brian said, "the way you always have." Something passed across Dom's face. The heavy, complicated kind of almost smile that only appeared in moments like this, one when the weight of the history between them made regular expressions insufficient. "Drive first," Dom said. "Talk after." They got back in their cars. The Charger came to life with that deep, chest-occupying rumble, the sound less of an engine and more of a decision being made by something very large and very certain about itself. Brian's Skyline answered with its own note. Precise, twin-turbo, the controlled voice of a machine that had been built for exactly this, side by side. The way it was supposed to be. 2 miles east of the beach, in the parking lot of a strip mall off Lincoln Boulevard, 3 surveillance vans sat behind darkened windows. State-of-the-art monitoring equipment. Directional audio with an 800-meter range. Multi-frequency intercept capability running across 6 dedicated channels. 3 two-man teams on rotating 6-hour shifts, deployed under a classified operation that their handler had described as routine post-operation monitoring. Standard protocol, Precautionary, entirely standard. At 4:47 p.m., every screen in every van went dark. Not a power surge, not a system fault. The equipment didn't cycle, didn't throw error codes, didn't flicker. It received a single pulse of precisely calibrated frequency interference and simply ceased to function. In the silence that followed, a single line of text appeared on every blank screen. No sender, no origin trace, no mechanism that any of the 6 analysts could subsequently explain. Stop watching. O'Connor, the team lead in Van 3, picked up his radio. He held it for a long moment, staring at the screen. Then he set it down. And somewhere on the Pacific Coast Highway, running north through the golden afternoon light, with the ocean glittering to their left and the whole uncertain future somewhere ahead, a black Charger and a white Skyline moved side by side at identical speed. Not racing, not competing. Just running together the way they always had, identical in direction and identical in purpose. Brothers, by every definition that actually mattered. The fight was not over. In this timeline, it was just beginning. Cut to black. From the darkness, clean white letters rise slowly, deliberately, the way things rise when they mean it. The O'Connor strategy, 6 months. That's how long it took Brian O'Connor to build the most sophisticated counterintelligence architecture a crew of street racers had ever assembled. And he built it quietly. He built it in the hours after Mia fell asleep and before Jack woke up. He built it in agency system access windows that lasted exactly 22 minutes each before the authentication tokens expired and needed cycling. He built it in phone calls to Mr. Nobody that were logged as family welfare check-ins and ran precisely as long as classified operational briefings. He built it because of a name, Cipher, the routing signature he had identified on the beach, the one thread that matched the surveillance architecture Cipher had used during her God's Eye pursuit. Had taken Brian 3 weeks of cross-referencing Interpol databases and DSS threat assessments to confirm. He later described the process to Dom only as a series of educated guesses that got uncomfortably specific. What he found made something cold move through him, not fear. Brian O'Connor had processed fear out of his operational vocabulary a long time ago. What he felt was something more precise and considerably more dangerous. Recognition. Cipher wasn't finished. The submarine battle had dismantled her immediate capability, destroyed her leverage over Dom, and scattered her network. But it hadn't eliminated her. She had rebuilt before. She was a systems architect, and systems architects didn't stop after one failure. They learned. They adapted. They came back with better understanding of what had defeated them, and what had defeated Cipher in Russia was family. Brian recognized that methodology. Because understanding your opponent's weakness and exploiting it systematically was what he had done in the underground racing scene in 2001, what he had done in Miami, what he had done in every undercover assignment. Build complete understanding first, act second, and never let the target see the building happening. The difference was that Cipher had been running this methodology for over a decade, and her board was global. Berlin in November pressed its weight against everything. The city carried its history the way certain people carry old injuries, not as weakness, not quite as pride, but as something that had been absorbed so completely it had become structural. You felt it in the architecture, in the particular quality of the cold that came off the spree at night, in the way the neon on the Mitte district storefronts bled long and distorted across wet cobblestones after rain. Brian stood at the window of a 4th-floor safe house overlooking Alexanderplatz, his tablet running a 3-dimensional traffic overlay of the surrounding 6 city blocks. Behind him, Ramsey sat cross-legged on a chair with her laptop balanced on one knee. 17 simultaneous processes running across 4 browser windows, network monitors, frequency scanners, and the centerpiece of 6 weeks of focused work, a custom Cipher signature detection algorithm she had built from scratch and named, with the particular pride of someone who had been told it couldn't be done, Viper. "Run me through it again," Brian said, without turning from the window. Ramsey pulled her screen around. "Viper flags any encrypted packet using the 6-node proxy routing architecture I reverse-engineered from Cipher's known operations," she said. "False positive rate is under 3%. In the past 11 days, I've flagged 2 separate instances of Cipher's signature active within Berlin's cellular grid." Quote, Locations? Mobile. She doesn't hold still long enough to pin. Ramsey paused. Brian. She's here. The crew had assembled over the previous 4 days in the careful, dispersed way that professionals assembled when they couldn't afford to look like a group. Different flights, different hotels, different arrival windows. Tej had come in first, establishing himself in a rented garage space in Kreuzberg that now contained enough electronic countermeasure hardware to blind every surveillance network within a half-mile radius. Roman had arrived second, complaining specifically and at length about the weather, the food, and the philosophical injustice of Berlin in late autumn, until Brian looked at him once and Roman went unusually quiet. Dom and Letty had flown in separately, 48 hours apart. The operation they were running, the stated reason they were all in Berlin, was, on its surface, exactly what it appeared to be: an EMP device, military-grade, compact, capable of disabling all electronic systems within a 3-block radius, a piece of hardware that 2 separate intelligence communities were quietly trying to acquire before the other did, currently being offered by a black market broker operating out of a financial firm in the Mid-District. The agency wanted it secured. Brian wanted something more precise than that. He wanted Cipher to try to take it first. She's going to move on Dom, Brian told the crew at the pre-mission briefing, his voice flat and clinical in the way it went when he was done with theory and working in fact. He had a whiteboard behind him covered in connection diagrams and timeline annotations that looked, to anyone who didn't know better, like the wall of a man who had lost perspective. Every connection was documented. Every inference was sourced. Not on the device. She doesn't need the device. She needs Dom. She's been studying his operational patterns since Russia. She knows he's the most effective close-terrain driver alive. Whatever she's planning next, she needs him in it. He circled a word on the board with a red marker, and the way she acquires people is always the same. The word sat on the whiteboard in the silence of the room. Leverage. She can't leverage Dom here, Letty said from her position against the far wall. The edge in her voice was specific and familiar, the one she reserved for people who suggested Dom was a vulnerability to be managed. She doesn't know that, Brian said. She thinks Elena and little Brian are still at the East LA safe house. We put the false digital footprint in place last week. Fabricated communications, consistent GPS pattern, normal daily routine. Cipher believes she still has the option. He paused. She'll make contact before the Berlin job. She'll try to take control of Dom's vehicle during the operation. She'll use it as a demonstration, proof of leverage before she makes her ask. The room was quiet. And when she does, Brian continued, Ramsey will have her IP signature. Dom was leaning against the wall with his arms folded, watching Brian work the briefing with the specific quality of attention he always brought to Brian's operational thinking. Not deference, something more considered than that. The attention of a man who had learned, across 17 years, and more impossible exits than either of them could comfortably count, that this particular mind was worth following into places that looked from the outside like they had no exit. You're using me as bait, Dom said. Brian met his eyes. I'm using you as the most effective counterintelligence asset in the room. Yes, something settled in Dom's posture. Okay, he said. The operation began at 11:14 p.m. The EMP device was housed in the basement of a Mitte financial firm inside a reinforced security case requiring biometric access and a 6-digit rotating code. The building's security infrastructure was state-of-the-art in the specific way that security systems, built by people who underestimated the crew, always were. It lasted 11 minutes. Tej brought the external feeds dark at 11:14. Brian and Dom entered through the loading dock at 11:16. Dom had the case in hand at 11:22. By 11:25, they were back in their vehicles. Dom in the Charger Tantrum, a 1,650 horsepower carbon fiber machine that sounded like a controlled industrial incident, threading through Berlin's midnight streets toward the extraction point. The first 2 minutes were clean. At minute 3, Dom's steering wheel went rigid, not the hydraulic resistance of a system under load, the specific, unnatural lock of something external overriding the input. Dom felt it in his palms first, that sub-millimeter vibration as the electronic power steering received a competing command from somewhere it wasn't supposed to receive commands from. His foot was still on the accelerator, the car still moving, but the wheel was pulling left with the quiet insistence of a system that had already decided where it was going. The dashboard display flickered. A single line opened in the center screen. Remote interface active. She's in, Dom said over the comm. His voice was completely level. In the safe house, Ramsey was already moving. Both hands on the keyboard, Viper running at full capacity, pulling the intrusion packet apart layer by layer and chasing its origin back through the routing chain in real time. She was talking under her breath in a low continuous stream. Not panic, something far more controlled than panic. Node 1, Node 2, burning the proxies. She's layered, but she's not fast enough. She thinks she has him. In the Charger, Dom drove. He let the wheel do what it wanted. He felt the car being guided onto the Unter den Linden, that broad, historically weighted boulevard cutting through the center of Berlin, and he understood exactly what was happening. Cipher was staging him. Pre-selected location, physical constraint, a kill window for whatever came next. The wheel wanted him to stop. Dom did not stop. He felt the moment her system reached for his engine. That same half-second throttle hesitation Brian had described in the briefing, the tachometer needle dropping a fraction before correcting, and he held the accelerator steady and waited. Then Brian's voice came through the comm. One word, now, a tone in Brian's GTR Nismo, clean and single, one precise electronic pulse as his thumb found the frequency jammer tucked between the seats. The device ran for 4 seconds. 4 seconds was all it needed. Cipher's remote connection to the Charger died mid-command. The steering wheel came alive in Dom's hands. He felt it immediately. The complete, total return of a machine that was his again. Every input direct, every response immediate. He hit the accelerator with full intention, and the Charger responded the way the Charger always responded to full intention from Dante Reyes, which is to say, without compromise. And he drifted the final extraction corner with the unhurried mastery of a man who had been doing this specific thing his entire adult life and had never once doubted his right to do it. In the safe house, Ramsey sat back from her keyboard. On her screen, Viper's trace had completed. "I have her," she said. Then, louder, her voice doing something it rarely did. "Brian, I have her IP. I have her position." Through the comm channel, the dead frequency that Cipher had been using for the override, now silent and abandoned, Brian heard a voice. One word. Cold. Controlled. Absolutely furious. "O'Connor?" Brian keyed his mic. His voice was the same temperature it always was. "Your hack just gave Ramsey your IP signature," he said. "We know your aircraft registration. We know your routing architecture. We know your operational signature." A pause. Shorter than the first. "We're coming for you." The channel went dead. The debrief happened 3 hours later in the Kreuzberg garage, the crew still carrying the specific electricity of an operation that had gone precisely the way it was supposed to go, which was rare enough to feel like something worth marking. Ramsey had not merely traced the IP. She had used Viper's reverse trace function to pull metadata from Cipher's intrusion packet, device ID, cellular tower routing, authentication timestamp architecture. Cross-referencing that data against international air traffic records took her 45 minutes. She turned her screen around. "She runs everything from the air," Ramsey said. "Modified Antonov AN, 1-2, registration VTLR, 7, call sign Vulture, flight plan filed to a ghost registration, destination listed as nowhere." She looked up. "Brian, I can track this plane." "Then we know where she is." "We know where she was," Brian said. "We know her aircraft. We know her routing. We know her signature." He turned to face the crew. "Now we start building the board." Outside the garage windows, Berlin rested in its complicated way. Not quiet exactly, never fully quiet, but reduced to its night register. The city that had survived everything processing the small hours with the patience of something that had learned not to be surprised. And somewhere over the North Atlantic, in a modified cargo aircraft with its screens turned off and its running lights dark, a woman sat alone in front of her own reflection in a dead monitor. Her fingers hadn't moved in 11 minutes. She was not accustomed to this feeling. She reached up and, very deliberately, opened a new analytical framework on her primary screen. She typed 2 words at the top of the blank document. "O'Connor, Brian." and she began to build. The DSS database flagged it at 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday. Brian almost missed it. He had been running a routine facial recognition sweep, something he did every 72 hours now without exception, feeding surveillance imagery through Interpol's South American Criminal Network database with the methodical patience of a man who understood that the threats worth worrying about were the ones that moved slowly and quietly and gave no warning until they were already inside the perimeter. The result came back with a confidence score of 91.3%, on a face that every official record in 6 countries agreed was dead. He stared at the match for a long time. The image had been pulled from a security camera at a private banking facility in Sao Paulo. The subject's profile was visible for approximately 2 seconds as he passed through a lobby. 2 seconds was enough. The file that came back was thin, most of it redacted, some of it burned entirely, but the core facts were there, sitting in clean government font like they had always been there, waiting for someone to look. Reyes, Dante Alejandro. Dob, 1983. Knock, Hernan Reyes, deceased. Status, deceased. Certificate filed August 2011. Attending coroner, Dr. Marco Fleitas, Rio de Janeiro Municipal Health Authority. 3 lines below that, in Ramsey's Viper annotation system, a secondary flag that made Brian's jaw tighten. Dr. Marco Fleitas, convicted of falsifying death records for criminal organization, 2013. Currently serving 8 years, Bangu 1 Correctional Facility. Brian pulled the financial records next. It took an hour working through 3 separate shell company architectures, built with the kind of patience that only exists in people who have decided to make patience itself into a weapon. What he found at the end of that hour was not subtle. 70 months of systematic capital accumulation flowing through a structure registered as Fundación Reyes, the Reyes Foundation, a charity with a stated mission of community development, and 6 cryptocurrency wallets seeded quietly in 2012 that had grown, through extraordinarily well-timed decisions, to a combined value of approximately $400 million. $400 million, over a decade of planning, and at the center of it, alive, rebuilt, and fully operational, was a man who had watched Dom Toretto take everything his father built, who had drowned for 2 clinical minutes in a Rio harbor, and who had apparently used those 2 minutes to arrive at a clarity of purpose that was nothing short of terrifying. Brian sat back. He looked at the ceiling. Then he printed everything, picked up his phone, and called Dom. Dom answered on the second ring. "Get dressed," Brian said. "We're going to Rio." The city received them the way Rio always received people, with that layered, complicated warmth that was simultaneously an embrace and a warning. The kind of city that had survived enough to understand that everyone who arrived wanted something and had long since decided to be the one doing the taking. Brian drove from the airport in a rented Civic that nobody would look at twice, which was entirely the point. "Walk me through why he's a problem," Dom said from the passenger seat. "He's not a problem yet," Brian said. "That's exactly why we're here now." He navigated a roundabout with the automatic competence of someone who had driven in enough foreign cities that the variables had stopped being variables. In 4 years, maybe 5, he'll have the resources and the network connections to become a catastrophe. He's been building a revenge infrastructure with your name at the center of it. How specific? Brian reached into the back seat without taking his eyes off the road and dropped a manila folder onto Dom's lap. Dom opened it. Photographs. A private office, walls covered in surveillance images, maps, printed timelines. Brian's face was there, Letty's, Mia and Jack, little Brian, Tej and Roman, Elena, and at the center of the arrangement circled in red, with multiple annotations radiating outward like the spokes of something designed to collapse inward. Dom. Dom looked at the photographs without expression, which with Dom was never the same thing as looking at them without feeling. He processed the way he always processed genuine threats, not with fear, but with the cold, methodical weight of a man who had learned early that panic and response were separated only by the breath you remembered to take. "He wants me to suffer," Dom said. "He wants to dismantle everything you've built," Brian replied. "Everyone you love. The way his father built something and watched you take it apart." He paused at a light. Through the windshield, Christ the Redeemer stood on his hill above everything. Arms open, the city spread beneath him in its magnificent fractured sprawl. The difference is Dante has patience his father never had. Dom closed the folder. What's the play? Brian glanced across the car. The ghost of something that wasn't quite a smile. We take his board away, he said. Tage and Roman had been in Rio for 18 hours before the main crew arrived, and in those 18 hours, Roman had located 3 restaurants, befriended the owner of a tuner garage 6 blocks from their safe house, and established himself as a fixture in a card game at a bar around the corner. This last achievement in particular required a level of social instinct that Brian had spent 17 years taking entirely for granted. He was done taking it for granted. At the briefing, Tej laid out what they had learned. The Fundación Reyes operated from a building in the Barra da Tijuca district. Ground floor was legitimate charity work, soup kitchen, community outreach, after-school programs that genuinely served the neighborhood. Floors 2 through 4 were administrative. Floor 5 had a separate elevator and biometric entry. Floor 5 is where he plans, Brian said. Has to be, Tej confirmed. The operation had 2 components running simultaneously, which was Brian's preferred structure. Not from distrust, but because the best operations created problems an enemy couldn't watch in 2 places at once. Component 1 was Dom. He would drop his name into the underground circuit and let physics take over. Dante Reyes had grown up in his father's criminal empire. He knew exactly what Dom had taken from it, and regardless of how much discipline years of careful planning had built in him, some part of Dante, the part that had drowned and come back with different wiring, would not be able to refuse the provocation of Dom Toretto standing on Rio's streets. Component 2 was Brian. While Dom raced, Brian would enter the Fundación Reyes building through a maintenance access point Tej had identified, reach floor 5, and document everything he found. Just document? Roman asked. And one other thing, Brian said. He set a laptop on the table and turned it around. Split screen. On one side, a transfer interface Ramsey had built. On the other, the account architecture Brian had spent 3 days mapping across Dante's financial network. $400 million, Brian said. 9 accounts, 4 jurisdictions. Ramsey has the transfer protocol ready to execute on my signal. The room went quiet. Where does it go? Letty asked. Brian tapped the screen. Orfanato Santa Maria, Rio de Janeiro. The Santa Maria Orphanage, he said. They've been housing children displaced by Hernan Reyes's criminal operations for a decade. He looked up. Seemed appropriate. Dom was looking at him in a way that was difficult to read, the way Dom looked at things that impressed him past the reach of his usual vocabulary. Let's go, was all he said. The race happened at midnight in the Zona Norte. Dante drove a Lamborghini Huracan, matte black, Italian engineering, 610 horsepower of the most deliberately impressive money could acquire. It was the car of a man who had spent years constructing a story about what power looked like and had confused the story for the thing itself. Dom's Charger Tantrum looked like something that had crawled out of the American industrial soul and decided to be angry about it. 300 people turned out. Word moved fast in Rio's underground, and Dom Toretto's name bent reality slightly toward spectacle. Dante stood beside his Lamborghini and looked at Dom across the road with the specific hunger of a man who has rehearsed a moment for years and is now discovering that the real version doesn't follow the script. Whatever composure years of planning had built in him, something older was underneath it. Something that had been sitting in salt water for 2 minutes in 2011 and had come back different. Dom looked back at him the way Dom looked at every opponent, with absolute, complete, unperturbed calm. The race ran through favela streets, steep, winding corridors of concrete and color where every turn was a commitment and every straightaway was a conversation between machine and nerve. Dante drove with technical precision, the Huracan gripped and calculated with Italian authority. But there is driving. And then there is what Dominic Toretto does. When Dom drives, it is not a negotiation. It is a merger. The car becomes an extension of something that operates below calculation. He feels the turn before the turn exists, processes the obstacle before it fully appears, and the machine responds not to input, but to intention. They crossed the finish line 1 car length apart. Just one. Enough to be a victory, not enough to be a humiliation. Because Brian had asked Dom to keep Dante's pride intact, and Dom had understood exactly why without being told. Dante needed to be present for what came next. He stepped from the hurricane, assembling the opening line of something he had been rehearsing for years. His phone buzzed. He looked down. A financial notification. His private banking application. A balance. 0. He refreshed it. 0. He opened another account. 0. 9 accounts across 4 jurisdictions, every balance identical, every transfer timestamped within the last 37 minutes, all routing to the same destination. Orfanato Santa Maria received $400,247,891.22. The blood left his face in a way that had nothing to do with losing a race. A message arrived from a number that had already ceased to exist. Your father suffered. You'll just be poor. B. Dom watched Dante read it. Watched the color leave him. Watched years of architecture, the patience, the planning, the righteous fury that had sustained a man through 2 minutes of drowning and a decade of meticulous reconstruction. Watched all of it dissolve in the 30 seconds it took to read 6 words and 1 initial. He got back in the Charger without saying anything to Dante. There was nothing to say. Brian was at the safe house when Dom arrived. Laptop closed, cold water in his hand, the specific expression of a man who had completed a task and was already thinking about the next one. The money goes to children, Dom said. The children his father displaced, Brian confirmed. Dom set the flash drive containing Floor 5's documentation on the table between them. He held it there for a moment, feeling the weight of what it represented. Not cleanly, not without complication, but in the only way the world allowed. Next, he said. Brian opened his laptop. On the screen, a grainy agency photograph, traffic patterns, a city, and a DSS notation in clean government font. Tokyo, Japan, ongoing asset protection. Op subject, Han Sasul O. Tokyo, Brian said. Dom was already standing. Here is what Brian O'Connor could not stop thinking about. Han Sol-O had walked into Dom's life with the easy, unhurried grace of someone who had always belonged there, and then walked out of it in the wreckage of a Tokyo intersection, and the crew had carried that loss the way you carry the death of someone who made every room they entered better. Not in loud grief, not in obvious mourning, but in the specific quiet that settles permanently over the spaces where that kind of person used to be. The thing is, Brian's access to agency systems was not merely surveillance capability, it was history, and in the history, buried in a classified operational subdirectory that required Mr. Nobody's personal clearance code and 3 separate authentication layers, Brian had found something that didn't fit together the way the official record said it should. An agency personnel file for an operative listed only as Han S. Current active contract. Deployment zone, Tokyo. Mission status, ongoing. Asset protection detail, Project Ares. Brian had sat with that file for 6 hours. Then he had called Mr. Nobody directly. Not the diplomatic version of that call. Not the one where 2 careful, intelligent people circled the classified edges of what they actually knew. The direct version. Han is alive, Brian had said. The silence on the other end of the line had been precisely long enough to confirm it. Who told you, Mr. Nobody had said carefully, that I was running an asset protection operation in Tokyo? You have Han Sol-O listed in your active contracts database. Project Ares designation, Tokyo deployment. He had paused. His death was faked. You staged it. And you've had him in protective custody for 2 years while he helped you secure the Ares technology. You're considerably more of a problem than your file suggests, O'Connor. I'm trying to help, Brian had said. Han's been alone for 2 years. The crew has been grieving someone who's alive, and whatever Project Ares is, if it's complete enough that you can afford to keep Han in Tokyo indefinitely, then it's complete enough for him to come home. He had kept his voice level. Let me go to Tokyo. Let me extract him cleanly. No more fake death. No more isolation. The protection program was necessary. I understand that. But it's been 2 years, and keeping him isolated from the only family he has is... Brian had paused, choosing his words carefully. It's causing damage that you don't have to cause anymore. The call had lasted 4 more minutes. When it ended, Brian had a flight to Tokyo, a specific address in the Shibuya district, and authorization to bring Han Sol-O home. Tokyo in early evening had a particular layered quality. Diesel and rain and the distant warmth of 1,000 restaurants pressing against the senses simultaneously. The city's 13 million people moving through their lives with the specific focused energy of a place that had decided forward was the only direction that mattered. Brian parked the rental R35 on a side street in Shibuya and checked his watch. 20 minutes. He sat with the engine idling and thought about Han. Not the asset. The person. The specific way Han moved through the world. That particular unhurried ease, as though he had arrived somewhere internally that most people spent their whole lives trying to find and then given up chasing arrival for its own sake. The way he ate, the way he drove, the way he had taken in a kid in Tokyo years ago and made it look like the most natural thing he had ever done. The quality of Han's loneliness, which was vast and carefully maintained, and which Brian had recognized because he carried his own version of it. Brian wanted his friend back. The address Mr. Nobody had provided was a modest apartment building in a quiet residential area, the kind of place that was deliberately unremarkable, where a person could live for years without neighbors remembering much beyond a polite greeting. 3rd floor, Unit 304. Brian climbed the stairs. He knocked twice. The door opened. Han Sol-Oh stood in the doorway with a bag of chips in one hand and an expression that moved through several stages in approximately 2 seconds. Surprise, recognition, understanding, and something that looked like relief but was quieter than relief, more complicated. O'Connor, Han said. The word carried an entire history inside it. You're supposed to be dead, Brian said. I've been getting that a lot, Han said. He stepped back from the doorway. You want to come in? Or are we doing this in the hallway? Brian stepped inside. The apartment was small, clean, and almost aggressively temporary. The kind of space that a person lived in without unpacking fully because they knew, at some level, that they wouldn't be staying. There were books, a laptop, a jacket on a hook, very little else. Han set the chips down on a counter. Mr. Nobody called ahead, he said. Told me you were coming. Told me... He paused. Told me you convinced him to end the protection detail early. You did the job. And you've been alone in Tokyo for 2 years while your family thinks you're dead. He looked at Han steadily. That needed to end. Han was quiet for a moment. 2 years, he said. Not to Brian, just saying it. I've been here 2 years. I know, Brian said. The crew. Doesn't know yet, Brian said. I wanted to tell you first, before everyone. He stopped, realizing he was uncertain about something for the first time in the conversation. Han, do you want to come home? Han looked out the window at the Tokyo evening, at the city that had been his refuge and his exile simultaneously, the place where he had built a life once before and then lived in the ghost of that life for 2 years, helping Mr. Nobody's organization while the people he loved believed he was gone. Han said. The girl you were protecting, Brian said. Mr. Nobody briefed me. She's part of this, right? Han nodded. She has the other half of Project Ares, in her head, literally. He looked at Brian. I can't leave her here alone. Then she comes too, Brian said. We have room. We have protection. And, he paused, she'll be safer with the crew than she is here. You know that. Then something in his posture changed. The specific resolution of a man who has been waiting for something he wasn't sure was coming and has just had the waiting end. Giselle, Han said quietly. Does Dom... He knows you never got over her, Brian said. We all do. That doesn't change anything. You're family. You've always been family. Han's throat moved. When do we leave? He said. Tomorrow morning, Brian said. I have tickets. I have clearance. Mr. Nobody is handling the paperwork. He looked around the small apartment. Pack what matters. Leave the rest. Han looked around the apartment that had been his cage for 2 years. There isn't much, he said. They flew out of Narita the next morning. Han sat by the window. Elle sat between him and Brian, small and quiet and carrying something in her head that governments had killed for. Brian had explained the situation to her in simple terms. The protection program was ending. She was going somewhere safer. There would be people who would look out for her the way Han had been looking out for her. She had looked at Han. Han had nodded. That had been enough. Somewhere over the Pacific, Han spoke. How long have you known? He asked. Brian looked up from the tablet he'd been reviewing. 6 weeks, maybe 7. Found your file by accident while I was tracking something else. He paused. Took me another 3 weeks to convince Mr. Nobody to let you come home. And Dom? Doesn't know yet, Brian said. Nobody does. I wanted... He stopped. I didn't want to tell them until I was sure. Until you were actually coming back. Han looked out the window at the ocean below. I've been dead for 2 years, he said. In their heads, that's... He searched for the word. That's not a small thing to undo. No, Brian agreed. It's not. Giselle was real, Han said. That grief was real. And I've been here, alive, while they... He stopped. You didn't choose this, Brian said. Mr. Nobody needed you for Project Ares. You did the job. You protected the asset. You did exactly what needed doing. He looked at Han. But yeah, it's going to be complicated when we land. Han was quiet for a while. Thank you, he said finally. For what? For coming to get me. Han looked at him, for deciding I'd been alone long enough. Brian looked at his friend, at this man who had been carrying isolation for 2 years, while the people who loved him carried grief, both kinds of weight equally real, equally damaging. You did the same for me once, Brian said, in Rio. When I didn't know if I belonged, you just... He gestured vaguely. You made space, like it was the most natural thing in the world. It was, Han said. This is too. Elle had fallen asleep against Han's shoulder. Han looked down at her, then back out the window. I'm ready, he said quietly. The Pacific moved beneath them, indifferent and ancient. Brian sent the message when they were 30 minutes from LAX. One text to the crew's group thread. Simple, direct. Coming home with a passenger. Meet at the house. B. The responses came back immediately. From Roman? From Tej. Details? From Letty. When Brian typed one more line. 2 hours. Trust me, he sent it. Then he put the phone away and didn't look at it again until they landed. The Toretto house at 1327 was exactly as Han remembered it. The driveway, the garage, the particular quality of afternoon light that Los Angeles had, and nowhere else did. The sound of voices from inside. The crew gathering because Brian had asked them to, trusting that whatever was coming mattered enough to drop everything. Han stood on the sidewalk with Elle beside him and his single bag in his hand. He had died here, in a way, 2 years ago when he had gotten on a plane to Tokyo to help Mr. Nobody with something classified and necessary, and had ceased to exist in every way that the people inside that house could measure. Now he was standing outside, alive, about to walk back into a grief he had caused by being absent. Brian stood beside him. You ready? Brian asked. No, Han said. Good answer, Brian said. He started walking toward the house. Come on. The front door opened before they reached it. Dom stood in the doorway. He looked at Brian first. Then his eyes moved to the person beside him. Han Sol-O. Alive. Standing on the driveway in the afternoon light with a bag in his hand and an expression that was trying very hard to be composed, and failing in the specific way that happens when a person is confronting something they had been certain they would never confront. Dom's face did something that faces very rarely did. It broke. Not dramatically, not loudly, but completely. Every structure that Dominic Toretto had built to carry the grief of losing Han, the acceptance, the sealed-away loss, the particular quality of moving forward that required not looking back, all of it came apart in the space of recognition. Han, he said. One word. Quiet. Carrying everything. Han crossed the driveway. Dom met him halfway. They didn't speak. There were no words for this. Dom pulled Han into an embrace that was less greeting than confirmation. The physical verification that this was real, that the person he had grieved was solid and present and breathing. Behind them, the crew had appeared in the doorway. Letty's hand went to her mouth. Roman made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Tej stood completely still, processing something that his analytical mind was having difficulty categorizing. Mia was crying. Han stepped back from Dom. He looked at all of them, at the family he had left, the people who had carried his loss, and he did the only thing there was to do. I'm sorry, he said. I was Mr. Nobody had me in Tokyo. Protection detail. Project Ares. I couldn't. He stopped. I'm sorry. You're alive, Letty said. Her voice was unsteady in a way it almost never was. You're here. That's. She crossed the driveway and pulled him into her own embrace. Don't apologize. Just don't. Roman was next, then Tej, then Mia, each of them taking their turn confirming what Dom had confirmed, that this was real, that Han was back, that the impossible thing Brian had somehow made possible was actually happening. When they were done, Han turned back to Brian. Thank you, he said. Brian shook his head. Your family. That's all this is. Dom looked at Brian for a long moment. Then he pulled him into the same kind of embrace he had given Han, the acknowledgement of something that didn't fit into regular categories of gratitude. How long have you known? Dom asked quietly. Long enough to be sure, Brian said. Dom nodded slowly. He understood. Brian had done this alone, quietly making certain before raising hope, protecting the crew from the possibility of another loss, even as he was working to undo the first one. Al needs a room, Han said, gesturing to the girl who had been standing quietly through all of this, watching the reunion with wide eyes. And he looked at the house. I don't know how long Mr. Nobody wants her in protection, but she stays here, Dom said. Not a question, a decision. As long as she needs. Han's expression did something complicated. Thank you, he said. That's family, Dom said. They went inside. The noise that followed was the noise of a family that had just gotten back something they thought they had lost permanently, loud and chaotic and full of questions and explanations, and the particular relief that only comes when grief gets unexpectedly reversed. Brian stood in the doorway and watched them. Mia appeared beside him, sliding her arm through his. You did this, she said. I just found him, Brian said. Mr. Nobody had him the whole time. You brought him home, she corrected. That's not small. Brian looked at Han, at the way he was sitting with the crew around him, answering questions, eating chips with the same unhurried ease he had always had, as though 2 years of isolation could be set down as simply as a bag. No, Brian agreed. It's not. Cipher did not make mistakes. That was not arrogance. It was operational record. She had built a career, an empire, if she was being precise, and she was always being precise, on the foundational principle that information was absolute power, and that the person with the most complete information won. Every time. Without exception, every operation she had ever run was backed by total surveillance, every target fully mapped, every contingency pre-calculated to 3 layers of depth, which made what O'Connor had done in Berlin particularly difficult to sit with. She was running the analysis for the 11th time. The Vulture moved through a cloud bank somewhere over the mid-Atlantic, its hull vibrating at the low constant frequency she had lived with long enough that she no longer registered it consciously. Her wall of screens was fully active. City feeds, financial monitors, satellite overlays, the sprawling nervous system of an intelligence network that processed more real-time data than most government agencies. On one screen, isolated from everything else and running on a loop, was the 11-second window of Brian's frequency jammer activation. 11 seconds. In 11 seconds, he had severed her connection to the charger, protected Dom Toretto, and given Ramsey enough of her IP signature to begin tracking the Vulture's position. She had changed routing protocols within 4 minutes of detecting the trace. New proxy architecture, new MAC addresses, new authentication layers. Ramsey was good. She was genuinely, impressively good. But Cipher had been running dark operations for over a decade. She wasn't worried about the trace. She was worried about what the trace meant, because Brian O'Connor had not stopped the Berlin hack reactively. He had been waiting for it. He had deployed a pre-positioned countermeasure that required advanced knowledge of her methodology, which meant he had reverse-engineered her operational signature from historical data and built a response before she acted. He had understood her before she moved. That was not something that happened. Cipher had spent months after the submarine disaster rebuilding, studying what had gone wrong in Russia. The answer had been clear. She had underestimated family as an operational variable. She had treated Dom's connections as leverage points to be exploited, not as a defensive network that could absorb her pressure and redirect it. She had never modeled Brian O'Connor properly, because after Furious 7, Brian O'Connor had retired. That assumption had been correct when she made it. It was now catastrophically wrong. Cipher was the kind of person who found catastrophically wrong assumptions not humiliating but clarifying. Wrong assumptions were just information, corrected and absorbed. She corrected this one. She opened a new framework on her primary screen, typed a name at the top of a blank document, O'Connor, Brian, and began to build the model she should have built before Russia. 3,000 miles west, Brian was doing the same thing. He had a whiteboard in the Toretto safe house dedicated entirely to Cipher, separate from the Berlin briefing board, already covered in connection diagrams and timeline annotations from 6 weeks of analysis. Ramsey was across the room running God's eye queries at 15-minute intervals, monitoring digital signatures that might represent Cipher's field operatives. The picture Brian had assembled was not reassuring. The Vulture had covered 6 continents in the past year. Cipher maintained active operatives in 32 cities. Her financial network processed approximately $2 billion annually through an architecture so well obscured that 3 separate intelligence agencies had failed to conclusively identify its origin point. She was, by any objective assessment, the most capable independent intelligence operator alive. But Cipher's greatest asset had never been money or network. It was leverage. Brian's analysis of her confirmed operations showed the same structural pattern every single time. She never moved directly against a target. She found the thing they could not afford to lose, acquired it, and converted them into instruments. Owen Shaw's brother, Jacanda's pursuit of God's eye, Dom himself in Cuba and Russia, she was going to try again. She's making a play for Elena, Ramsey said from across the room. Not urgently. Ramsey delivered critical intelligence with the same steady tone she delivered everything, which was one of the things that made her invaluable. 6 of Cipher's operatives entered Los Angeles airspace in the past 4 hours. 3 separate flights. Movement pattern converges on the East LA safe house. Brian felt the timeline compress. God's eye shows Elena at the safe house as of 30 minutes ago, Ramsey continued. But Ramsey looked up. She hasn't been there since yesterday morning, Brian said. She and little Brian are at a secure location outside the city. Hobbs has them. A small pause. The digital trail showing Elena at the safe house for the past 3 weeks is the false footprint we built. It's doing exactly what we built it to do. Ramsey looked at him for a long moment. You've been running a counter-operation inside the operation, she said. Since Berlin, Brian confirmed. I needed to know when and where she'd send people. She just told me both. He picked up a marker and moved to the whiteboard. Now we use the operative she just deployed to send her a message she can't misread. The East LA safe house was a clean craftsman bungalow on a street where the biggest daily event was disagreements about parking, the kind of neighborhood that felt safe by design, regular routines, familiar faces, the comfortable predictability of a place where nothing dramatic had ever happened. The kind of street that would make any extraction team feel like they had the advantage. Cipher's 6 operatives approached in 2 teams in the early morning dark. Professional movement, professional equipment, professional intentions, a clean extraction. Non-lethal where possible, single target, minimal collateral engagement. The lead operative produced a lock override at the front door. The door opened, too easily. He raised a fist. Both teams froze. Silence inside the house. Then a single soft electronic tone from somewhere deeper inside. He looked at his phone. No signal. No signal! Every phone in both teams had gone dark at exactly the same moment, and in the electronic silence that followed, he heard something else, a low subsonic vibration from the next room, and the specific click of something activating. EMP, he said, but the word arrived too late to be useful. On the rooftops of 2 adjacent buildings, Roman Pierce and Tej Parker lowered their non-lethal pulse rifles and surveyed the street below with the quiet satisfaction of people who had set a perfect trap and watched it close exactly the way it was supposed to. All 6, Tej said into his comm. 6 vehicles, too, Roman confirmed. 6 highly trained operatives stood in a darkened craftsman bungalow in a quiet Los Angeles neighborhood with no communications, no vehicles, and no operational capability. Inside, in what appeared from the exterior to be a living room, Letty and Ramsey had been running a digital warfare station for the past 20 minutes. Every communication device the operatives carried was now open, unencrypted, and actively feeding Ramsey everything it contained. "She's receiving the confirmation now," Ramsey said, her voice tight with focus. "The false uplink we seeded into their devices is transmitting to Cipher's network. She thinks the extraction was successful." "How long before she knows it's not?" Letty asked. "She won't be able to verify. Her team just went dark." A pause. "By the time she realizes, because the team is currently incapacitated," Roman's voice came over the comm from the rooftop, "by 0 police officers. Because the police in this neighborhood have been otherwise occupied for the past 40 minutes. Because Tej made a phone call. Because Tej is remarkably talented at phone calls." "You're welcome," Tej said. 5,000 feet above the Atlantic, aboard the Vulture." Cipher received the confirmation report. She allowed herself the single controlled exhale of a person who does not show relief but understands its function. The leverage was secured. The next phase could begin. Dom Toretto could be activated. She reached for her secure comm channel. Every screen went dark. Not gradually, simultaneously. Every monitor, every satellite feed, every data stream, gone in the space of a single heartbeat, replaced by a darkness so absolute it felt physical. Then, on her primary monitor only, a single line appeared, white text on black. Clean and precise. "You can't blackmail what you can't find." O'Connor. Cipher sat very still. Her hands were flat on the desk. She was processing something that was not technically anger, though it contained anger the way a storm contains lightning. It was the particular experience of recognizing, for the first time in a career built on the absolute premise of informational superiority, that she had been outmaneuvered, not just in this operation, not just today, systematically, methodically. From the moment the surveillance van at the beach had gone dark months ago, he had been watching her watch him. He had let her believe she was building toward leverage, and in the space of that belief, he had built a trap around her. Cipher picked up a glass from her desk. She set it down again with great, deliberate care. "O'Connor," she said to the empty room, not acknowledgement this time. A declaration. In the Toretto house living room, Brian's phone buzzed. One notification. The Vulture had changed course, turning north, transponder signature already switching to a new registration. Running. Brian looked at the notification, then he opened the group thread and typed 4 lines. "Elena's safe. Little Brian's safe. Cipher's blind. Get some sleep. Round 2 starts tomorrow." He set the phone on the table and looked through the window at the early Los Angeles morning coming in. That specific Pacific gold that existed nowhere else on Earth, the kind of light that made everything look like something was beginning. He turned back to the whiteboard, because Cipher was running, which meant she was not done, and neither was he. The file was 37 pages. Brian had read it 4 times. The first time through, he had read it like an analyst. Clinical, cross-referencing dates, flagging inconsistencies, building a chronology of an operative career that was by any objective standard extraordinary. The second time, he had read it thinking about Dom. The third time, he had read it thinking about the 1989 crash and everything that had followed it. The fourth time, he had sat with the file closed in both hands for a long while before he went upstairs, knocked twice on Dom's door, and said, "There's something you need to see." Dom had read it at the kitchen table in the dark. When he finished, he sat without moving for a very long time. Brian sat across from him and waited, because there was nothing useful he could say yet that was fully formed enough to be words. And Brian had learned across 17 years that Dom's silences were not empty spaces. They were processing time, and they were not to be interrupted. Dom had a brother, not a distant relative with complicated family politics. A brother. Same blood, same surname, same house growing up, same father, same loss. A brother Dom had exiled after the worst night of both their lives and had not spoken to in 26 years. A brother who had become, according to 37 pages of classified agency documentation, one of the most effective deep cover operatives in Mr. Nobody's organization. "His designation is in the active contracts database," Brian had said eventually. "Toretto, Jay. He's been operating under it for 8 years. Dom had been staring at a surveillance photograph from the file. A man who looked, in the jaw and in the eyes, and in the particular way he held his head at a slight angle that suggested he was always watching more than he appeared to be watching, undeniably and unmistakably like Dominic Toretto's brother. He was in Tokyo, Dom had said. The operation to protect Han. And L, Brian had confirmed. Project Ares. He was Mr. Nobody's primary asset on the ground. For how long? The Tokyo deployment? 2 years. Same window Han was there. Brian paused. They worked together. According to the file, Jakob was the one who helped set up Han's cover. Dom had set the photograph down carefully. My father's crash, he'd said. That's why I woke you up, Brian had said. There's something in the file about it you need to read. London in autumn wore its gray and gold the way certain people wore complicated histories, not hiding them, not performing them, simply carrying them as part of the overall weight. The Thames moved its dark water between stone embankments that had watched several centuries of the things that humans did to each other, and the parks burned orange under overcast skies. And the city went about its business with the patient competence of a place that had learned not to be surprised by anything. Brian had chosen the Victoria Embankment Gardens with care, public enough to be non-threatening, contained enough to monitor, ambient noise sufficient to defeat directional audio within standard surveillance range. He had swept it himself 90 minutes before the meeting. Dom Toretto was already there. He was sitting on a bench facing the river, wearing a gray jacket, hands in his pockets, watching a barge make its slow way downstream. His body language performed relaxation. His awareness of every person within 40 meters was absolute and unmistakable to anyone trained to read it. In person, he was younger looking than the surveillance photograph suggested, and harder simultaneously, the compressed quality of someone whose years had been intensive rather than extensive. His jaw was Dom's jaw. His eyes were something different, quieter, more internalized, the eyes of someone who had lived a long time inside their own reasoning. He didn't turn when they approached. I made you at the park entrance, he said without preamble. Both of you. The sweep pattern was DSS. Former, Brian said, taking the adjacent bench. Dom sat beside him. Jacob looked at his brother. Across the river, a gray heron stood motionless on a stone step with the absolute patience of something that had been doing exactly this for a very long time. The silence between the two brothers was not empty. It was full of 1989, and every choice made in the years that followed, every hardened decision, every version of a life that had been built in the space created by that night and that exile. Dom spoke first. You killed Dad. Flat. Not an accusation shaped like a question. A statement of the belief that had been load-bearing in his interior architecture for 26 years. Jakob looked at him. No, he said. I didn't. His voice was measured and careful in the way of someone who has rehearsed this conversation so many times that they've discovered the rehearsed version is insufficient and are now trying to find the real one in real time. I found a crack during the pre-race inspection. I told Dad. Jakob paused. He told me some things you raced through anyway. He made the call, not me. You were working on the car when the race started, Dom said. Not a question, a memory surfacing. I was trying to fix it, Jakob said. My hands were on the engine block when he took the green flag. When the car went, the first pause that wasn't controlled. I got to him before the fire crews. I tried to get the door open. The frame had buckled. He looked down at his hands. I have the scars. If you need to see them, he held his hands out. Brian had pulled the medical records 3 weeks ago from the hospital in Los Angeles. A 15-year-old Dom Toretto treated for second and third degree burns on both hands on the night of the crash. The records existed. They were unambiguous. They were the kind of documentation that did not lie. Dom looked at Jacob's hands. He looked at them for a long time. I was 15, Jakob said. I lost my father, and then I lost my brother. The measured quality of his voice slipped just slightly, a mask shifting rather than coming off. Because you needed someone to blame, Dominic, and I was standing there. I know, Dom said. 2 words. Quietly. Jacob looked up. I found the crash investigation report, Brian said. He placed a folder on the bench between them. Original investigators' files, mechanical failure analysis from the Racing Commission archives. It supports what he's telling you. He looked at Dom. Read it. Dom picked up the folder. He held it without opening it for a moment. I've known for 20 years, he said. Not loudly. Something in the back of my head has known for 20 years that it wasn't you." He looked up at the gray London sky. "But knowing something and accepting it are different things," Brian said. "Yeah." The heron lifted from its stone step across the river, one decisive wing stroke, graceful beyond what its size should allow, and was gone. "I was wrong," Dom said. 3 words, not an apology. Dom Toretto found apologies insufficient for the weight of real wrongs, social gestures standing in for actual reckoning. What he said instead was more costly than an apology. He named the wrong precisely, from the responsible party's perspective, with no qualification and no distribution of blame. "I was wrong." Jacob sat with it. 30 seconds of silence before you spoke, he said finally. That's new. Something moved through Dom's face that in a less guarded man would have been a laugh. "Brian's influence," he said. Jacob looked at Brian. Something complicated moved through his expression. "You're the one who found me," he said. "Your operational signature," Brian said. "And your last name. It's the one thing in your entire cover that you didn't change." He paused. "I don't think that was an accident." Jacob looked away for a moment. "No," he said. "It wasn't." "Otto," Brian said, "you've been feeding him bad intelligence." "Not a question." Brian had run the analysis across 12 weeks of cross-referencing the decisions of Otto's organization against what their intelligence advantage should have allowed. The pattern was consistent and unmistakable. Someone with genuine inside access was systematically feeding Otto scenarios that looked viable and led to nothing. Jacob reached into his jacket. He produced a phone. On the screen, operational plans, personnel files, financial records. 3 months of documentation. "I've been waiting for the right moment," he said. He set the phone on the bench. "I've been waiting for Dom to find me." He glanced at Brian. "I didn't expect him to bring a cop." "Former cop," Brian said. "He says that a lot," Dom said. Jacob stood. He picked up the phone and handed it to Brian. Project Ares data, both halves. The complete operational picture of Otto's organization delivered without ceremony or condition. "I've been carrying your family's safety in my pocket for a year, Dominic," he said. Dom looked at his brother. He said the 2 words that cost him most, not the 3 he had said before, which had closed something, but the 2 that opened something. "Come home." Jacob's throat moved. He had been living in every version of the life he had built in Dom's absence, inside the specific quiet of waiting for something he was not certain was coming. Now it was here, and it didn't feel the way he had imagined it. Not the dramatic resolution of something long deferred. Something smaller and larger simultaneously. The first clean breath after a very long time underwater. "Welcome home," Dom said, and extended his hand. Jacob Toretto looked at his brother's hand. Then he took it. You have to understand what Brian was building. Not a crew with better equipment. Not a more sophisticated version of the operations they had always run. Not even the kind of counterterrorism infrastructure that governments spent billions of dollars constructing and still managed to build with critical blind spots and corrupted access points. He was building a world. Underground racing had always been more than racing. Anyone who had spent real time inside it understood that at a level that was difficult to explain to people who hadn't. The circuits existed in every major city on Earth, through Tokyo's mountain passes and Rio's favela switchbacks and London's industrial outskirts and Miami's coastal straits. And they were not just venues, they were communities, cultures, networks of trust assembled over years by people who had, for various reasons, decided that their loyalties lived outside the official structures the legitimate world provided. Brian had grown up in law enforcement. He understood official structures, their genuine strengths, their systemic blind spots, the specific vulnerabilities created by bureaucracy and hierarchy, and the institutional need to document everything. He had spent 17 years navigating the membrane between those structures and the underground world he had walked into in 2001 and never fully left. Now he was going to use everything he had learned in both worlds simultaneously. The plan had 7 components running across 6 continents, managed by a crew that was beginning to function less like a collection of individuals and more like a single organism with a very diverse nervous system. Han and Sean Boswell took Tokyo. They built it over 6 weeks with the particular patience of people who understood that the most durable things are built slowly, not through force or territorial claiming, the Hernan Reyes method, which produced empires with short half-lives, through the more sustainable method of being genuinely, undeniably the best in the room. Han's reputation in Tokyo's racing community was its own kind of currency. Sean's adaptability in the drift scene created relationships that held. And beneath the races themselves, beneath the competition and the spectacle, and the thousands of people who turned out because they wanted to witness something real, Tej was building something that had no visible surface at all. Every race venue in Tokyo's circuit became a node, not in the crude hardware sense. In a distributed communication architecture that Ramsey designed and Tej implemented, encrypted relay points embedded in existing wireless infrastructure, piggybacking on signals already present, generating no detectable footprint. A message sent through the Tokyo node bounced through 7 relays before arriving at its destination, and the encryption key rotated every 4 hours. In Miami, Tej and Roman converted 3 race venues into what appeared, from every external angle, to be exceptionally well-equipped tuner shops. The kind of spaces that racing culture generated naturally. Walls hung with aerodynamic components and performance electronics, floors carrying the particular layered smell of high-octane fuel and machine oil, and years of serious mechanical work. Below the surface, server infrastructure of the kind that handled the analytical workload of a mid-sized intelligence operation, distributed across enough physical locations that no single point of failure could take the network down. London was Jakob's domain. He rebuilt it from nothing. Using the contacts accumulated across 8 years of mercenary work, the relationships that existed in the particular underground where weapons and vehicles and operational capability changed hands among people who asked few questions and required only demonstrated competence as credential. Tuner shops in East London, import specialists in the financial district, a racing club in Brixton that was genuinely a racing club, which was the most effective cover possible. Below the racing club, a weapons cache that could equip a small army. Rio was Dom and Letty. The city received them the way cities receive legends, with the particular charged energy of people who had heard the stories and were not quite prepared to believe them until the man himself was standing 3 feet away. Dom raced. Not every race, but enough, and his presence in a race was never purely competitive. It was the assertion of a standard. This is what it looks like when a person and a machine operate as a single thing. This is what it costs. This is what it means to fully commit to the quarter mile instead of hedging against the outcome. In the territories that Hernan Reyes had controlled through fear and violence and the coercive certainty of a man who believed he owned everything he looked at, something different began to take hold. Not a power vacuum, which the criminal world filled with its own reliable efficiency. Something more complicated than that. Racing culture, community, the particular democracy of a discipline that did not ask about your history, only your speed. In Los Angeles, Brian and Mia ran the Nexus. The Toretto house at 1327 had always been the center. The Thursday barbecues had always been more than barbecues. They were the mechanism by which a family that existed outside every official category of human relationship maintained itself, repaired the strains that operational life created, and reminded itself what all of it was actually for. Brian understood this completely, and he honored it without alteration. He added one layer. The Thursday gatherings became operational briefings that looked indistinguishable from barbecues. The driveway conversations became intelligence exchanges that felt like conversations. The racing that happened afterward, on streets that the LAPD had, through a series of carefully managed conversations with their chief that Brian had facilitated, decided not to prioritize on Thursday evenings, was both genuine competition and a demonstration of what the O'Connor strategy meant at its most fundamental level. That this family was untouchable, not because they were invincible, but because they had built something that existed in the spaces between official power structures, operated on loyalties that money and coercion couldn't reach, and was led by 2 men who had turned their combined capabilities into something none of their opponents had ever fully modeled. The night it became concrete was a Tuesday in October. A lieutenant from the LAPD's organized crime unit arrived at the Thursday race with 50 officers and the energy of a man who had been waiting a long time for exactly this opportunity. He was compact, career-minded, and had built his professional identity around the belief that institutional authority was personal virtue. The crowd saw the lights. The crowd went quiet. Dom walked out of the garage. He crossed the parking lot the way Dom crossed every space. Unhurried, immovable, the specific authority of a man who had never found a room he needed to make himself smaller for, and stopped at the lieutenant's squad car. "You sure you want to do this?" Dom asked. The lieutenant looked at him. He had been told various things about Dominic Toretto over various years, and none of them had prepared him for the absolute untroubled certainty in the man's face. 50 officers, the lieutenant said. Legal authorization. You're done, Toretto. Dom pulled out his phone, made one call, said nothing, replaced the phone in his pocket. 45 seconds passed. The lieutenant's radio crackled. His own dispatch, calling his badge number. He picked it up. The voice on the other end belonged to the office of the mayor of Los Angeles. 3 minutes after that, his officers received text notifications from the office of the chief of police outlining the Toretto family's long history of contribution to the Police Widows and Orphans Fund and suggesting that resources might be more effectively deployed elsewhere that evening. 2 news vans arrived from separate networks to cover what their tip lines had described as a community racing program that had reduced youth gang involvement in Boyle Heights by 37%. The lieutenant stood in the parking lot. He looked at his 50 officers. He looked at the cameras. He looked at Dom, who had not moved and whose expression had not changed. He got back in his squad car. The race went on. Brian watched from the garage doorway with a bottle of water in his hand and the controlled ghost of a smile on his face. "That's the underground empire," he said quietly, to nobody in particular. Mia appeared beside him, sliding her arm through his. "You built it," she said. "We built it," Brian said. She looked at him for a moment, the look of a woman who had been paying attention for 17 years and knew exactly what she was looking at. "You're not going to stop," she said. "Not accusation. Statement. Not until it's done," he said. She leaned her head briefly against his shoulder. "I know." A pause. "Just come home every time." "Always," Brian said. She went back inside, to Jack, to the warm noise of the family filling the house, and Brian O'Connor stood in the doorway and watched his crew race under the Los Angeles night and felt the particular weight of a man who has chosen both things and refuses to let either one make him betray the other. Brian O'Connor had made a significant number of tactical decisions across the course of the O'Connor strategy. He ranked this one among the most important, and privately among the most personally overdue. Roman Pierce had been Brian's friend since they were teenagers, running the streets of Barstow with more speed than sense, and considerably more loyalty than either of them ever articulated. He had been Brian's operational partner in Miami, his brother in every functional sense. The man who had shown up without question for every impossible situation across 17 years, whose presence was so consistent it had become something Brian had stopped consciously registering, the way you stop registering the foundation of a building you live in. Roman also had, by any honest tactical assessment, been running at approximately 40% of his actual capability for 17 years. The loudness, the performance, the running commentary on his own potential death that arrived with the consistency of weather in every high-stakes situation. Brian had laughed at it, appreciated it, and, he was honest enough with himself to admit this, taken it at face value in a way that had been unfair, because Brian had been watching Roman drive for 17 years. And what he saw underneath the performance was precision, not approximate skill, not good enough under pressure capability, genuine, significant, rare precision that Roman's own persona had been systematically obscuring, the way a very bright light in a window made it impossible to see what was inside the house. "I need to be honest with you," Brian said, on the first morning of training. They were in the facility's vehicle bay, a climate-controlled space filled with training vehicles in various states of preparation. Roman had the expression he deployed when he sensed honesty arriving, and had mixed feelings about receiving it. "The performance you've been running for 17 years, Brian said. The jokes, the attitude, the commentary. It's kept people from taking you seriously, including people who should have known better." He paused. "Including me." Roman was quiet for a moment, which in itself was information. "But here's what I've actually been watching," Brian continued. "I've been watching you execute vehicle maneuvers under pressure that 90% of professional tactical drivers couldn't replicate. I've been watching you maintain spatial awareness in multi-vehicle scenarios that DSS drivers train for years to develop. I've been watching you survive situations that killed people who were, on paper, better qualified than you. He looked at Roman steadily. That's not luck. That's never been luck. Roman's jaw moved. I've been coasting, he said. You've been performing, Brian corrected. There's a difference. Coasting implies no effort. What you've been doing takes effort. It's just been going into the wrong channel. He held Roman's gaze. Cipher has deployed a network of autonomous vehicles, AI-controlled, running stolen technical hardware across the German Autobahn. We need the data core from the convoy's second vehicle. The operation requires one person, operating alone, no backup past the initial briefing window. He paused. I want that person to be you. Roman stared at him. A convoy, he said. Alone. I want the most underestimated operator I have ever worked with to show me exactly what he can do when he stops pretending he can't do it. The silence stretched. That was emotional, Roman said finally. I mean, every word, Brian said. Like, genuinely, that landed somewhere. Roman, I'm processing. Take your time. A pause. Okay, Roman said. What do I need to know? Phase 1 was documentation. Brian ran Roman through the complete DSS tactical driving curriculum, pit maneuvers at speed, controlled pursuit and evasion, high-load cornering under sustained pressure, vehicle-to-vehicle transfer protocols. These were capabilities Roman already had. Brian knew that. The purpose of Phase 1 was not instruction. It was to make Roman watch himself. Every session was recorded. Every debrief involved Brian pulling the footage apart frame by frame and showing Roman precisely and without editorial commentary what was actually happening. This corner approach, Brian said during the third debrief, freezing the footage. You began weight transfer adjustment 0.4 seconds before the optimal entry point. You didn't calculate that. You felt it. He looked at Roman. That's not something I can teach. That's what you are. Phase 2 was tactical. Brian taught Roman something that had no formal curriculum name, but that Brian had developed from 17 years of operational practice. The architecture of misdirection. How to weaponize an opponent's pre-existing model of you. How to present exactly the version of yourself that your enemy had already decided you were. Loud, impulsive, reactive, manageable, and move through the gap between that version and your actual capability before they understood the gap existed. You've been doing this your whole life, Brian told him, unconsciously. Every person who has ever underestimated you has handed you an advantage. We're going to start using that advantage on purpose. I've been using it to avoid paying for dinner, Roman said. We're going to use it to take apart a Cipher convoy, Brian said. Phase 3 was solitude. The day before the operation, Brian cleared the facility. Just Roman and a 2015 GTR, Brian's secondary vehicle, handed over with the specific gravity of someone acknowledging what the handover meant. And one final briefing. 5 autonomous vehicles, a 9 Autobahn, traveling in tight formation at 110 kilometers per hour. The second vehicle carries the encrypted data core. Pit it out of formation, access the core before the convoy's self-destruct protocol initiates, clear the area before federal police respond. Brian looked at him. 7 minutes total from first contact to clear. Roman looked at the GTR. He placed his hand on the roof. No jokes, he said. No jokes, Brian confirmed. No backup. First 90 seconds I'm in your comms, Brian said. After that, he looked at Roman with the directness that meant he was saying something he had decided deserved to be said plainly. You don't need me. Something moved through Roman's face. Something that his performance would have immediately converted into deflection. A quip, a theatrical moment, comedy used as a pressure valve for the thing underneath. This time, he didn't convert it. He let it be what it was. Copy that, he said. The German Autobahn at 2 a.m. was a specific kind of empty, not the desert emptiness of American highways. The reduced, disciplined emptiness of European infrastructure at night, long-haul trucks and early commuters moving in their lanes, the road functional and purposeful even in the small hours. Roman drove north at a steady cruise until the GTR's modified sensor suite painted 5 contacts on the display. Tight formation, 110 kilometers per hour. The second vehicle, black panel van, indistinguishable from the others, carrying the data core. Roman breathed. He thought about what Brian had shown him on the debrief footage. He thought about the version of himself on that screen, the one that hadn't been performing, that had just been driving, and the particular strangeness of seeing yourself as you actually are after years of seeing yourself as you've decided to appear. He drove. The approach came in at 180 kilometers per hour, closing speed controlled, trajectory calculated, everything calibrated to the geometry of one precise moment. Brian's voice in his ear, the last 90 seconds. Pit the second car. It'll create a gap. Use it. Roman closed the distance. The pit maneuver required absolute commitment. Half measures produced unpredictable outcomes. Roman hit the second van's rear quarter panel at the exact angle and speed the physics required. The van broke left, caught the third vehicle's bumper, both of them crossing the right lane in a controlled chaos that opened exactly the gap the briefing had described. Roman was through it before the movement settled. The lead vehicle's AI evasion response was sophisticated. It responded to what had already happened. Roman was responding to what was about to happen. He drew alongside the lead van, activated the EMP, and watched all 5 AI systems cut simultaneously. 5 driverless vans coasting to nothing. Roman stopped the GTR beside van 2. Out of the car, into the panel, data core extracted and secured. Back in the car. 40 seconds. He looked at the clock. 5 minutes and 41 seconds elapsed. 1 minute and 19 seconds of buffer remaining. He drove clean and steady away from the disabled convoy with the data core on the passenger seat, moving through the dark German morning with the particular internal quiet of a man who has just done something that doesn't require description. 15 kilometers clear, he activated his comm. Convoy neutralized, he said. His voice was completely level. 0 collateral. I'm heading home. On the other end of the comm, Brian was silent for a moment. Then, copy that? A pause. Welcome to the next level, Rome. Roman Pierce drove through the dark for 4 hours without making a single joke. Not as discipline, not as performance of a different kind, simply because there was nothing that needed to be said. It turned out that was more than enough. The anomaly appeared on a Monday. Brian almost missed it again, which was the design. Whoever had built the access pattern had done it with the specific, practiced understanding of how surveillance systems worked and how human attention, even very disciplined human attention, had limits. The anomaly was 3 layers deep in the agency's access logs, buried in a subdirectory that most authorized users didn't know existed. But Brian had learned agency architecture directly from Mr. Nobody. And Mr. Nobody had said, during one of their earliest briefings after Furious 7, something that Brian had written down in the notebook he kept, for things that mattered more than they initially appeared. The most dangerous threat inside any intelligence organization isn't the external enemy. It's the internal one who's learned the institution's language well enough to look exactly like part of it. The access log entry was time-stamped 3:17 a.m., the dead window, the lowest attention hour of every surveillance cycle. The files accessed were classified operational records. Cross-referencing what had been read with what those files contained told Brian within 40 minutes 2 things. First, whoever had accessed these files was searching for the Toretto family, specifically for current locations, operational patterns, known safe houses, and the particular category of information that intelligence professionals called, in language that Brian found clinically precise and personally nauseating, leverage architecture. Second, the access credential used was legitimate. Internal agency clearance, not a breach from outside. The mole was inside. Brian did not go through channels. Going through channels in a compromised organization was how you got killed. The report went to the right supervisor. The right supervisor forwarded it to the wrong person, and the person who filed it had an accident on a highway 48 hours later. Brian had seen this sequence often enough to have stopped needing to think about it. He called Dom instead. "We're going to need to make a house call," he said. The agency headquarters occupied 3 floors of a commercial office tower in a district so deliberately unremarkable it had achieved its own form of camouflage. The tenant listing described it as Meridian Analytics Group, a name whose blandness was so complete it had become invisible. The people who moved through its lobby looked indistinguishable from the staff of any mid-level consultancy. Suits, laptops, purposeful movement, no visual interest whatsoever. Brian and Dom walked through the lobby without slowing. "The guard at reception. Young, trained, carrying the specific quality of attention of someone who had been told precisely which people to worry about, stood as they approached. Brian held up his tablet without stopping. On the screen, Mr. Nobody's personal authorization protocol. 7-character code. Active timestamp. The guard's hand, which had been moving toward his comms piece, stopped. Brian and Dom walked past. On the 4th floor in the operational command wing, they found the office. Desk nameplate M. Reed. Empty. But the terminal was active and unlocked. Brian sat down. In his ear, Ramsey's voice was already running. I have remote access to his session. 6 windows open, 2 active searches. A brief pause. Brian, he's been running Toretto family location queries for 3 weeks. Show me what he's been transmitting, Brian said, pulling outbound communication logs now. A pause. He's in regular contact with an encrypted external server. 7-node proxy architecture, same routing signature we flagged from the Dante Reyes financial network. The room went very still. Reed has been feeding information to Dante Reyes, Brian said. Dom was at the window looking at the city below with his arms folded and his back to the room. He came after the family, Dom said. For close to 2 years, Brian confirmed. He opened the upload window and loaded Ramsey's virus. It was not a blunt instrument. It was a surgical tool designed to execute 3 tasks in sequence without triggering the agency's intrusion detection systems. Task 1. Copy the complete evidence package of Reed's communications into a secure server accessible to agency leadership. Task 2. Permanently delete every file, record, reference, and notation connecting the Toretto family to any agency operation past or present. Task 3. Lock out every compromised access credential in the system. Brian started the upload. He watched the progress bar. Behind him, the office door opened. Marcus Reed was built with the broad-shouldered, controlled physicality of a man who had played competitive sport and carried it into intelligence work as part of his operational toolkit. He stopped in the doorway and read the room in half a second. Unauthorized access, active terminal, intrusion in progress. 4 security officers behind him. O'Connor, he said. His voice was entirely controlled. You have committed a federal offense. Stand up. Brian did not stand up. He was watching the progress bar. Treason, Reed continued, moving into the room. Unauthorized access to classified systems. Interference with ongoing operations. Ongoing operations, including transmitting Toretto family location data to an active criminal organization, Brian said, without turning from the screen. The security officer stopped moving. I don't know what you believe you've found. Ramsey has your complete communication history with the Reyes network, Brian said. 642 outbound contacts across 22 months. It's being delivered to agency leadership right now, along with your financial records, which are... He glanced at the tablet update Ramsey had just pushed. Not subtle. The progress bar reached 100%. 3 lines appeared on the screen. Upload complete, deletion complete. From behind the security officers, a voice. Stand down, gentlemen. Mr. Nobody walked into the office with the particular unhurried authority of a man who had spent his career operating 3 steps ahead of every room he entered. He was followed by 2 individuals whose training was evident in the precise economy of how they moved. Marcus. Mr. Nobody said you are under arrest for espionage, conspiracy to endanger federal assets, and, as a personal observation, operational security failures that I find genuinely embarrassing given who trained you. He paused. I'm disappointed. The security officers looked at each other and stepped aside. Reed's expression moved through several stages. Fury first, then the rapid cold calculation of someone assessing whether any play remained. Then the particular resignation of an intelligence professional who has recognized that the board is complete and the outcome is fixed. He looked at Brian. You wiped the files, he said. Every one, Brian said. He stood. The Toretto family doesn't exist in agency systems anymore. No safe house records, no operational histories, no personnel files, no leverage points, nothing. He looked at Reed steadily. You came after people I love. The least I could do is make sure nobody can do it through these systems again. Dom stepped forward. He stopped in front of Reed and looked at him. This man, who had been the hidden threat operating inside the organization built to protect them, doing it from behind a legitimate credential and the invisible authority of institutional belonging. "You chose this," Dom said. Reed said nothing. "Whatever you told yourself to justify it," Dom said, "you chose it. Every day for 2 years, you chose it." A pause. "Remember that." He walked past. Brian followed. Mr. Nobody fell into step beside Brian in the corridor. "The virus," Mr. Nobody said. "Surgical," Brian said. "No collateral damage to operational systems. And the family files. 7-pass overwrite. Not recoverable." Mr. Nobody nodded slowly. "You understand what you've done. By deleting those files, the family has no agency connection. No government record is operational assets. If something happens, we handle it ourselves," Brian said. "The way we always have." Mr. Nobody looked at him for a moment, with the expression of a man who had been in the business long enough to know the difference between recklessness and something more considered. "I'm glad you didn't retire, O'Connor," he said. Brian stepped into the elevator. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." The doors closed. The family was officially off the grid. Invisible. Untouchable. And somewhere in a holding room on the 4th floor, Marcus Reed sat with his hands flat on a table and the specific understanding of a man who had played a long game against people he had catastrophically underestimated. Dante Reyes had nothing left. His $400 million sat in a children's orphanage. His planning infrastructure had been documented and forwarded to Interpol. His intelligence partner was in federal custody. His network of contacts had been systematically isolated over months of quiet operational pressure. Years of meticulous, patient construction had been taken apart with the same methodical precision he had used to build it, by a man using methods that were the mirror image of his own, executed with greater patience and greater reach. He had nothing, which was, as Brian had noted in his operational notes, and as Dom had confirmed without elaboration, a specific category of danger. Because men who have nothing left also have nothing to lose. And Dante Reyes, who had drowned for 2 minutes in a Rio harbor and come back with rewired priorities, was not the kind of man who accepted the end of everything he had built by quietly disappearing. He was the kind who burned things on the way out. Brian flagged it through God's eye on a Thursday morning. Facial recognition match from a Fiumicino airport arrivals camera. Dante Reyes traveling on a forged Swiss passport, arriving in Rome from Istanbul. 2 large checked bags, the specific body language of someone who had already made every decision that needed making and was at peace with what came next, the peace of simplification. Brian had seen it before, in targets, in colleagues, once or twice, in the mirror during the worst periods. He ran the predictive model. Rome was hosting a G20 summit at the Vatican in 11 days, 40 heads of state, 2,000 international press, a global television audience in the hundreds of millions. Maximum stage, maximum audience, maximum opportunity for a man with nothing left to make Dom Toretto's name synonymous with catastrophe on a scale that would outlast every other thing Dom had ever done. Brian called the crew. Rome received them with the magnificent, practiced indifference of a city that had been hosting history for 2,000 years and had developed a settled attitude about dramatic arrivals. They came in over 48 hours, individual arrivals, different hotels, standard protocol, and assembled in a rented villa in the Trastevere district. The briefing room held maps, not digital displays. Paper maps of Rome's street system printed at scale, marked up by Brian and Ramsey over 2 days of satellite imagery analysis. Rome's traffic architecture was ancient in the most literal sense. Streets that had been streets since the Republic, following the contours of a city built before the concept of traffic flow had been invented. A labyrinth designed for pedestrians and horses, now carrying the weight of millions of modern vehicles with the resulting chaos that implied. Brian knew which chaos to use. "Dante needs a physical route to the Vatican," he said, standing at the largest map. "He's lost his technical capability. He can't hack traffic systems, can't clear a route electronically. He has to use the road network." He traced the possible approaches with a marker. 4 viable vehicular routes to the Vatican complex that can accommodate armored vehicles. We're going to be on all 4 of them. He assigned positions. Han and Jacob at the Colosseum. Eastern approach. hand for precision, Jakob for the particular controlled aggression of someone who had spent 8 years as a mercenary and was now applying it in the right direction. Together for the kind of force that required both qualities simultaneously. Roman and Tej at Piazza Navona. Central routes. Roman for misdirection, the version of Roman that the Autobahn had revealed. Tej for technical support. Letty and Mia at the Tiber River Bridge. Southern access, the most defensible choke point in the entire route architecture. Brian had looked at Mia when he assigned the position. "I'm in," she had said before he could qualify it. "I know," he had said. Dom and Brian at the Vatican approach itself. The final line, the position that if everything else worked, would see nothing at all, and if something failed, would place the two most capable operators in the crew between Dante Reyes and a global catastrophe. They had 48 hours. Dante's convoy entered Rome from the south at 6:23 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. 3 armored Mercedes-Benz Unimogs, heavily modified, 8 mercenaries, an explosive device capable of collapsing a significant portion of the Vatican's eastern facade, and Dante Reyes himself in the lead vehicle, broadcasting live to 11 social media platforms simultaneously. He was speaking to the camera as he drove. He spoke about his father. Not the criminal, not the man who had built an empire on other people's suffering. The father, the man who had been present and fierce, and who had believed in what he built with the absolute conviction that made all the difference between an empire and just a collection of holdings. He spoke about the vault heist, about the harbor, about drowning. He spoke with a calm and a clarity that was genuinely compelling and genuinely terrible simultaneously. He did not look like a terrorist. He looked like a son who had been destroyed by something and was explaining to the million people watching in real time exactly why. That was more disturbing than any manifesto could have been. In the eastern approach, 2 cars appeared ahead of Dante's convoy, moving in opposite directions. When they reached the choke point, 40 feet of road between ancient stone walls, they stopped. Side by side, blocking everything. Dante's lead driver assessed the obstruction and rerouted toward the central streets, toward Piazza Navona, where Roman and Tej were already in position in the parking structure above the road. "Spikes on my mark," Tej said. "Mark," Roman confirmed. The articulated strips dropped across both lanes. The convoy's second vehicle hit them at 60 kilometers per hour, both front tires shredded in under a second. The Unimog lurched and stopped, blocking the right lane completely. The convoy was forced south, toward the Tiber. Letty saw them from half a mile. She drove onto the bridge straight at the convoy. Complete ownership of the vehicle. No acknowledgement that there was any other possible outcome than the one she intended. And while Dante's lead driver processed what a single car in the wrong lane meant, Mia activated the electronic warfare package from the passenger seat. Targeted frequency interference. Every electronic component in the lead Unimog's drivetrain cut out simultaneously. The vehicle coasted to a stop in the middle of the bridge. The remaining 2 vehicles had nowhere to go. Dante stepped out of the lead vehicle with his stream still live, still talking, camera in hand. He didn't see the 2 cars coming from the far ends of the bridge until they were already close. A black Charger from the north, a white GTR Nismo from the south, both carrying cables. Tej's kinetic tethering systems deployed and locked, trailing from both vehicles as they approached from opposite ends of the bridge at coordinated, converging speed. The cables reached Dante's Unimog simultaneously. "Latched. 3, Brian said, over the crew comms. 2, 1, pull." The Charger and the GTR accelerated in opposite directions. The Unimog lasted 3 seconds before the structural forces resolved. It lifted, rotated, and came down upside down on the ancient stone road of the bridge with a crash that cleared every pigeon from every rooftop within 2 blocks and sent fragments of cobblestone rattling against the bridge railings. The manifesto stream died. Brian was out of the GTR before it fully stopped, moving to the cargo compartment of the overturned vehicle. The explosive device was there. He had spent 4 days studying the schematics. His hands were steady. 23 seconds. He stood up, holding the disabled detonator as Dom arrived beside him. Safe. Done. Dante crawled from the wreckage, bleeding from his forehead, from one hand, getting to his knees on the ancient stone with a particular physical determination of a man who had drowned once and decided that staying down was not something he did. He looked at Dom. Dom extended his hand. Dante spat. Dom withdrew his hand without visible anger. "Your father chose crime," Dom said. His voice was quiet, without contempt, with something that was harder to name than either. "You chose revenge. Both of you chose wrong. And both of you lost everything you were trying to protect." Dante's expression held years of fury and grief, and it was collapsing under the weight of its own architecture. The elaborate structure of his hatred finally confronting the specific, terminal impracticality of the world it had tried to build. "You killed him," Dante said. "Your father made his choices," Brian said. He was beside Dom now, the dead detonator in his hand. He built an empire on other people's suffering and called it legacy. "Your actual legacy," he gestured at the overturned vehicle, the disabled convoy, the Italian federal police already crossing the bridge in force, "is this: a bomb that nobody will remember because it didn't go off. A manifesto that died with its broadcast." Italian authorities arrived in numbers. Dante Reyes was taken into custody above the brown water of the Tiber, which had witnessed 2,000 years of the things that humans did to each other, and found none of it, in the end, surprising. The crew assembled at the bridge railing. Nobody spoke for a while. Then Roman, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since the Autobahn, looked along the line of faces and said, "We just saved the Vatican." "Yeah," Tej said. "Should someone tell the Pope? A card, maybe. Just something simple." "Roman," Hans said. "I'm just saying." "We know what you're saying," Hans said. "Roman," Brian said. "Yeah. Good job today." Roman was quiet. Then, simply, "Yeah, we all were." The Tiber moved beneath the bridge. Rome continued its eternal business. "One more," Dom said. "One more," Brian agreed. Behind them, in Brian's earpiece, Ramsey's voice arrived, quiet and measured, carrying the weight of someone who had been tracking something long enough to understand exactly what finding it meant. "Brian," she said, "I have the vulture. Here is what Brian knew about Cipher. She had been hurt. Not physically. The vulture's mobility and Cipher's operational discipline made physical compromise close to impossible. What had been done to her was something more fundamental than physical injury. The Berlin hack that exposed her IP, the Elena counter-operation that blinded her intelligence network, the steady, methodical erosion of her capability, her reach, her leverage, her certainty. These had done something that Brian had been watching for and tracking carefully for months. They had made her desperate, and desperate Cipher was a specific and very serious category of danger, because Cipher desperate was Cipher who had recalculated and concluded that the patient, layered approach was no longer available to her. The plan Ramsey had intercepted in pieces over 4 days of monitoring was not subtle. It had none of the architectural patience of her prior operations. It was the plan of a woman who had looked at her board and understood that time had stopped being her asset. She called it Zero Day. The technical specifications were brutal in their simplicity. A simultaneous cyber attack against the primary electrical grid infrastructure of North America and Europe. Not targeted disruption, not strategic pressure. Total darkness, cities, hospitals, water treatment, transport systems. All of it failing simultaneously, in winter with no warning and no preparation. Ramsey had translated the casualty projections to Brian in clinical terms. Brian had sat with the numbers for a long time. "She's moved past leverage," he said finally. "Past leverage, past intelligence, past any strategic objective I can identify," Ramsey confirmed. "This isn't a negotiating position. This isn't even a threat. It's destruction for its own sake," Brian said. "Because she's losing. Because she's lost," Brian corrected. He pulled up the vulture's position on Ramsey's display. "She knows the board is empty. This isn't strategy. This is refusal to accept the outcome." Approximately 60 kilometers north of the Russian archipelago of Novaya Zemlya, above a section of the Arctic Ocean that spent most of the year under several meters of ice, Ramsey's tracking had placed the vulture in a holding pattern over these coordinates for 4 days, completely outside Cipher's usual operational behavior, which was constant movement. "She was waiting for something. The submarine," Ramsey said. She pulled up satellite imagery, false color infrared. And there, beneath the white, a shadow. long and cylindrical, deep and certain. A Russian Delta-class submarine, currently listed as decommissioned. Currently very much not. The zero-day architecture requires more broadcast capacity than the Vulture can provide alone, Ramsey said. She needs the sub's communications systems, military-grade, hardened, capable of the simultaneous multi-point broadcast that zero-day needs to run across both continents at once. Ramsey paused. Brian, if she launches from that submarine, we cannot intercept it digitally. The Russian military encryption is physical, Brian said. It has to be physical. He was quiet for a moment. She'll be expecting a helicopter assault, he said. Military response. Air-to-surface approach. She has anti-aircraft batteries on that conning tower. She does, which means air assault fails before it reaches the hull. It does. Brian looked at the satellite image for a long time. There's ice, he said. Clearly. There's ice, he said again, with a different weight on it. Ramsey looked at him. You're going to drive to the submarine, she said. We're going to drive to the submarine, he said. The Arctic did not receive them. It simply was vast and indifferent and ancient in the way that places are ancient when they predate every category that humans have invented for understanding the world. The temperature at the ice shelf was minus 34 Celsius. The wind off the open water added a factor that could kill an unprepared person in minutes and communicated its intentions about protected ones clearly. 6 vehicles. Dom's Ice Charger. The fate of the Furious machine rebuilt and re-equipped for the specific environment. Studded tires. Arctic fluid package. The EMP array on the rear deck now tuned for naval electronics rather than city infrastructure. Tej had fabricated a supercharger intake heating blanket in 48 hours that kept the engine functional in temperatures that would have killed a stock vehicle before it reached operating temperature. Brian's Ice GTR, the R35, stripped to its essential systems and rebuilt for the ice. Studded tires on all 4 corners. Twin turbos running a custom intercooler configuration. The all-wheel drive system converted from street performance advantage into survival necessity. Letty's Rally Fighter, armored. The only vehicle in the convoy designed from the ground up for terrain like this. Jakob's weapons platform, a modified Arctic truck carrying the technical payload for direct assault on a naval vessel. Roman and Tej on tactical snowmobiles, fast, low profile, capable of operating in the spaces between the larger vehicles. And Han, in a modified drift vehicle that was theoretically the worst possible machine for Arctic conditions, and which Han had spent 3 days converting into something that could perform controlled ice drifts at speeds that turned the terrain from an obstacle into a weapon. They assembled at 3 a.m. on the ice shelf. The sky was the color of deep water, not true darkness, because the high Arctic in this season had no true darkness, but a blue so deep and total it felt like looking up from the bottom of something. The northern lights moved overhead in their slow, impossible performance. Green and violet curtains shifting across the sky with the casual, sovereign majesty of something that had been doing exactly this for millions of years and found the audience, if it registered them at all, unremarkable. Brian stood at the hood of the GTR and looked at the crew. These people. He thought about that, about the specific, irreducible fact of these people standing on Arctic ice at 3 in the morning, in temperatures that could kill, about to drive their cars at a submarine because it was the right thing to do and because there was nobody else to do it. Dom, who had never once betrayed the people he loved. Letty, who had survived worse than this and carried it without display. Han, who had been alone for 2 years and was here now. Jakob, who had been alone for 26 years and was here now. Roman, who had become himself on a German highway and had been someone new ever since. Tej, who had turned mechanical genius into something that functioned like moral infrastructure. All of them. His family. She expects helicopters, Brian said. His voice carried clearly in the cold air. Anti-aircraft batteries on the conning tower. Torpedo capability for anything approaching by water. She's built a fortress inside a vessel designed to be the final word in survivability. He paused. What she doesn't have is any defense for 6 cars on ice. Because no one is this insane, Roman said. Correct, Brian said. I just wanted that confirmed for the record, Roman said. The decoys go first. 3 agency helicopters approaching from the south at speed. Standard assault pattern. Cipher's batteries engage immediately. That's 20 seconds, minimum, where her tactical attention is entirely on the south. He looked across the ice to where the submarine's conning tower was just visible against the deep blue, a dark vertical fin, surfaced for the communications array deployment. While she's looking south, we're already moving, fast and low. Dom and I take the hull, everyone else provides interference. When the EMP hits the submarine systems, we have 90 seconds before emergency dive protocol engages. And Cipher? Letty asked. She'll have an exit, Dom said. His voice carried the specific certainty of someone who has been studying an opponent long enough to know their architecture. She always has an exit. She'll run. And we'll be between her and it, Brian said. He got in the GTR. The agency helicopters appeared from the south at 3:17 a.m. Cipher's batteries tracked and engaged within 20 seconds. The 6 vehicles were coming from the east. At 3:18 a.m., the Vulture's ground-scanning radar detected the approach signature. Cipher had 8 seconds. She used 7 of them to understand what she was looking at. Cars on Arctic ice, 6 of them, moving in coordinated formation at speeds that should not have been achievable on this surface. She used the 8th second to say, very quietly, "Oh." The first torpedo was in the water at 3 hours, 18 minutes, and 9 seconds, tracking Dom's Charger by engine acoustic signature, the largest noise in the formation, running hard. Brian had the sonar signature through the GTR's external audio suite. 2 seconds. Dom left. Now! Dom went left with full commitment. The Charger's tail broke loose on the ice, and he brought it through a controlled slide that changed the vehicle's vector entirely before the torpedo passed through the space it had occupied. The explosion 30 meters behind them fractured the ice in a spiderweb pattern that spread 600 meters in every direction and did not reach any of the vehicles because they were already clear. Brian hit the NOS. The GTR launched forward with the specific, held-back violence of a machine that had been running below capacity and had just been given permission, and he was moving at angles the torpedo guidance system had not been designed to anticipate, carving arcs on the ice as though the car had become a direct extension of calculation, the angles pure and certain, the ice providing traction and resistance simultaneously in proportions that only made sense to someone who had done this in their head 1,000 times before doing it in reality. 2 more torpedoes, both missed. Brian was at the hull, 1 shot with the grappling assembly. The hook caught the conning tower's safety rail on the first attempt. He locked the tether to the GTR's chassis, nodded to Dom. Dom drove the ice charger up the ice ramp that had formed where the submarine surfaced, up the ramp and onto the actual hull, the metal skin of the vessel receiving 4,000 pounds of American muscle, with a sound that resonated across the ice shelf like something structural giving way. He activated the EMP array. The submarine's electronic systems ran for 1 second and went dark. Emergency dive protocol engaged immediately. The submarine began to move. Brian's GTR, tethered to the conning tower's safety rail, became exactly what he had said it would be. 700 horsepower of Arctic-modified resistance against a 14,000-ton naval vessel attempting to execute a crash dive. The physics were objectively ridiculous. The submarine pushed down. The GTR pushed back. The ice cracked outward from the tether contact point in a perfect radial fracture, and for 8 seconds the outcome was genuinely uncertain. Dom, on the hull, activated the explosive package he had placed during the 40 seconds he was on the surface. 3 precisely targeted breaches along the pressure hull's most structurally critical sections. The explosion was not dramatic, it was mechanical. The specific sound of metal doing exactly what it was not designed to do. The submarine shuddered. The dive protocol cut. The vessel began to list. Brian released the tether. The GTR slid back on the fractured ice. Dom cleared the hull in the Charger as Hobbs's extraction helicopter arrived overhead, with the timing of a man who had learned, over years of dealing with this crew, to have resources positioned before they were requested. The submarine was going down, slowly but certainly. On the ice beside Brian's car, a hatch opened on the submarine's emergency escape system. A figure emerged, compact, composed, wearing insulated equipment that had not appeared on any known manifest of Cipher's gear. She had an exit strategy. Of course, she had an exit strategy. Cipher stood on the Arctic ice and looked at Brian O'Connor 20 meters away. She had a vehicle waiting 3 minutes north on foot. She knew Brian knew this. He did know it. He was standing between her and it, quietly, without aggression, without triumph. Just present and still in the Arctic cold with the northern lights moving above both of them and the sound of the submarine's descent providing its final incongruous note. "O'Connor," she said. "Cipher," he said. "You can't prosecute me," she said. "Nothing attributable. You know that." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "Then what exactly are you doing here?" Brian looked at the ice, at the submarine settling into the dark water, at the lights moving overhead. "Making sure you understand something," he said. She waited. "Every operation you ran for years was built on one premise," Brian said. "That you could acquire people, that you could find what they couldn't lose, hold it, and convert them into instruments." He paused. "That's not a strategy. That's a definition of loneliness." Something moved behind Cipher's eyes, fast, then gone. "You built an empire on leverage," he continued. "And leverage only works on people who are isolated, people who don't have—" He glanced back at the helicopter, where Dom was already loaded and Hobbs stood in the door, anyone to share the weight with. The wind moved between them across the ice. "What happens now?" Cipher said. Brian stepped aside. Her path north was clear. She stared at him. "I'm not arresting you," Brian said. "The zero-day servers are wiped. The submarine's communications array is at the bottom of the Arctic Ocean. Your financial network has been dismantled over months. Your operatives are in custody in 6 countries. He looked at her steadily. "You can walk away, but the board is empty, Cipher. Every piece." She looked at the path north for a long moment. Then she looked back at Brian. "I'll rebuild," she said. "I know," Brian said. "And we'll be ready," Dom said, from directly behind Brian, where he had been standing for the past 30 seconds without either of them noticing. Cipher looked at both of them. Then, with a composure that was genuine and remarkable and deeply characteristic of who she was at her core, she nodded once. She walked north. The Arctic swallowed her in 3 minutes. Dom stood beside Brian. "You let her go," he said. "She has nowhere," Brian said. "And we'll know the moment she tries to rebuild. Ramsey will have a flag within a week of her making any significant digital contact." He watched the point where she had disappeared. "Caging her creates martyrdom and legal complications that expose things that need to stay buried. Letting her walk away with nothing is worse for her," Dom said. "Yeah," Brian said. The helicopter descended. The Arctic continued its ancient, indifferent work around them. The ice and the lights and the cold and the dark water where the submarine had gone. Brian O'Connor stood on the ice shelf of the Arctic Circle and felt something settle in him. Not an ending. It was never quite an ending. But the particular earned rightness of a board that had been played as well as it could be played by the people who were playing it. He got in the helicopter. The family went home. Thursday nights at the Toretto house were not events. They had never been events, not in the way that word implied something planned and bounded and contained. They were something older and less formal than that. They were the natural rhythm of a family that had chosen, week after week, across more years than any of them could now cleanly count, to come back to the same table, the same backyard, the same smoke rising from the same grill. The rhythm of people who had decided that maintaining something required showing up for it consistently, even when the showing up was ordinary, especially when it was ordinary, because ordinary was what you were actually fighting for underneath everything else. This Thursday felt different. Not in a way that needed announcing, it simply did. The light in the backyard had the particular quality of certain October evenings in Los Angeles, warm without the bleached exhaustion of summer, clear without the edge of winter coming. The kind of light that arrived only a handful of times each year, and that made people look at the faces around them and feel, briefly and completely, the full weight of the fact that everyone they were looking at was still here. Han was here. That changed the texture of everything, in the specific way that the return of someone you had grieved changes every space they re-enter. He moved through the backyard with the familiar, unhurried ease, that particular quality of presence that was neither performing nor withholding, simply fully occupying whatever space he was in. Tej had reintegrated immediately, instinctively, as though no time had passed and the 2 years had been a misunderstanding in the calendar. Roman had expressed what he needed to express once, privately, in a conversation that nobody else had been part of, and had sealed it back under the familiar operational cheerfulness that Brian now understood was not avoidance but management, a deliberate choice about what to carry visibly. Letty had simply talked to Han about nothing particular, about a car she was working on and the specific frustration of a suspension geometry problem that refused to resolve. Ordinary conversation. The most welcoming thing she knew how to offer. Dom had spent the first night Han was back in the garage with him, not talking much, working on an engine that neither of them particularly needed to work on, in the way that some conversations required tools to frame them and silence to carry what the words couldn't reach. Jakob was here too. He moved through the gathering with the careful attention of someone learning the grammar of a new place. Not uncomfortable, but very conscious, observing the rhythms and the customs and the specific language of this family with the precision of someone who wanted to understand before he participated. It was, Brian thought, probably the most honest thing he had ever watched a person do at a barbecue. Letty had been the one to simply include him. No ceremony, no acknowledgement of the weight of it. Just conversation, direct and without performance, the way Letty did everything. Brian watched Jakob exhale when she walked away. There were things between Dom and Jakob that were not resolved and would not be resolved quickly. You did not undo 26 years of separation and blame over a conversation on a London embankment, however significant that conversation was. What they had built there was a foundation, the recognition that a wrong had been named and a door had been opened. The structure itself would take what all structures took: time, proximity, the particular grinding ordinariness of shared daily life pressing the edges smooth. But the foundation was there, and that was everything. Brian was at the grill. He had inherited the grill from Dom approximately 2 years prior, during a period when the operational tempo had been high enough that Dom had missed 4 Thursdays running. And Brian had simply stepped in without comment, and Dom had accepted the transfer without comment, which was the specific wordless language of two people who had known each other long enough that the important things didn't require narration. Mia appeared at his shoulder with a glass of water and the expression of a woman who had been paying precise attention for 17 years and was currently cautiously allowing herself to rest. "You're happy," she said. Not a question. Brian considered the word. "I'm situated," he said. "That is the most Brian O'Connor sentence you have ever said." "We handled it," he said. "The threats we could see, we handled. The ones we couldn't see yet, we built the infrastructure to intercept." He watched the backyard, the crew and its various conversations, the light moving across all of them, Jack pursuing something across the grass with the absolute joyful commitment of a 5-year-old who had decided that whatever he was chasing was the most important thing currently happening in the world. "It's not finished. It's never actually finished." "I know," Mia said, "but tonight is good," she said. "Yeah," Brian said. "Tonight is good." She stayed at his shoulder for a moment, watching their son, watching the family around them, before she went back inside, back to the warm noise of the house that was still, after all of it, the place where all of this came back to. Dom found Brian in the driveway after dinner. Not deliberately. Brian had come out for air in the way that Brian sometimes needed air after sustained company. Not antisocial, just the introvert's periodic requirement for a moment of quiet before going back in. And Dom had followed with the specific instinct he had developed over 17 years for when Brian needed presence rather than solitude. They stood in the driveway without preamble. Dom's 1970 Charger RT was there, the original rebuilt again, the iteration of it that had come back from near total destruction more times than either of them kept track of anymore. It sat low and black and absolute, 900 horses of supercharged Detroit muscle under a hood that carried the accumulated dents of history like a record nobody had asked to keep and nobody was willing to erase. Brian's Skyline was beside it, the R34. Arctic Pearl White. Rebuilt and upgraded and retired and rebuilt again, the car that had been everywhere with him, that had become less a vehicle over the years and more a statement of continued intention, the specific declaration of a man who was still here and still moving. They stood with the two cars between them and the house behind them and everything that had happened in the past 2 years sitting in the air between them, not heavily but present. When we first met, Dom said, "I knew you were a cop inside 24 hours. Brian looked at him. "I know. I let you stay anyway. I know. Because you drove like something was at stake every single time," Dom said. "Like every corner was a decision, not a habit. Like you'd thought about why you were going fast before you went fast." He looked at the Charger. "I'd never seen that in someone who wasn't already family." "That was your teaching," Brian said. No, Dom said. It was already in you. He paused for a moment, searching for the word with the patience of a man who did not use words carelessly. Recognized it. They stood in the driveway. The night sounds of the neighborhood moved around them. Distant music from somewhere. A car passing on the street 2 blocks over. The particular ambient texture of an East LA evening that had not changed in the 20-plus years since either of them had first been here. The quality of permanence in a place that had survived everything thrown at it. Brian looked at the 2 cars. I was scared, he said. 2 years ago. On the beach. Dom turned to look at him. I had Jack. I had Mia. Brian gestured at the house behind them, lit from within, full of noise. All of this! And I knew if we walked away, it would eventually find us anyway, and we'd be unprepared, and the people I love would pay for it. He paused. Being scared of that isn't a flaw. It's just accurate perception. No, Dom agreed. I just chose to do something with it, Brian said. Dom was quiet for a moment. I should have looked for Jacob, Dom said, years ago. I should have looked. You were carrying something that wasn't yours to carry, Brian said. That takes time to put down. I cost him 26 years. You cost you both 26 years, Brian said. He made choices in that time, too. He could have found you. A pause. Pride moves in both directions. Dom looked at the Charger. Yeah, he said. The house behind them continued its warm, specific noise, the sound of people who had chosen each other, gathered around a table in a backyard on a Thursday night, doing the ordinary work of being a family. One more time? Dom said. He was looking at the 2 cars. Brian looked at them too. The Charger and the Skyline, black and white, 2 different philosophies of the same fundamental conviction that the road ahead was worth meeting at full speed, without hedging, without holding anything in reserve. I thought you'd never ask, Brian said. The streets of East Los Angeles at 10 in the evening had their own specific gravity, a low, nocturnal hum of engines and distant sound systems and the particular ambient energy of a neighborhood that had been this way for decades and would be this way for decades more, because some things were built from materials that outlasted every attempt to change them. The Charger and the Skyline rolled out onto the street side by side. No crowd, no staging lights, no wagers, no stakes, no outcome that mattered beyond the thing itself. They found the pace of the streets before they committed to anything. The particular unhurried quality of 2 men who had nothing to prove and everything to enjoy, who had earned across 17 years and everything those years contained, the specific freedom of going fast for no reason except that going fast was true. The road ahead was the same road. Or a road that felt like the same road, the one that had been the first real one for both of them back in 2001, back when Brian had built his car from scavenged parts and driven on pure nerve and something he hadn't had language for yet. And Dom had looked at him across the starting line and recognized something that changed both their lives. They knew the start without signaling it. The engines opened together. The Charger's deep, continent-shifting rumble and the Skyline's precise twin-turbo note, 2 completely different answers to the same question, both of them absolutely right, both of them expressing with absolute clarity the character of the person behind the wheel. The road ran straight and long ahead of them. They drove. This is the thing about driving done by people who have been doing it their entire adult lives. Driven for survival and for competition and for pure joy, often all 3 at once. It stops being technique at some point. The line between person and machine dissolves, and what remains is something that isn't skill in the technical sense. It is expression. The car becomes the direct output of who you are. The road becomes the medium, and the race stops being about arriving. Dom drove from the gut, from something that predated calculation, trusting the machine and the momentum, and the feel of the road speaking up through the chassis into his palms with the language he had been fluent in since before he could articulate what fluency meant. Brian drove the way he had become, precision over instinct, instinct over precision, the 2 no longer distinguishable in practice, the analytical mind and the instinctive self operating as a single thing so seamlessly that the distinction had become philosophical rather than functional. Side by side at the quarter mile, side by side at the half, side by side at the finish. Dead heat. The Charger and the Skyline coasted to the shoulder of the road together, engines dropping to idle, steam rising from hot metal into the cool night air. Both drivers sitting for a moment in the specific quiet that followed the thing you were made to do. Dom got out first, Brian a moment after. They stood at their cars, looking at the road behind them, and then at each other, and the 17 years between the first time they had done this and tonight were present in the air around them. Not as weight, not as burden, but as the particular substance that gave the moment its meaning. You could not have this without having had all of that. Who won? Dom asked. Brian considered the question for the appropriate amount of time. We both did, he said. We always did. That was never actually the point. Dom looked at him. The point, Brian said, was always that we were doing it together. Dom was quiet for a moment. Then he extended his hand, and Brian took it, and they pulled each other into the kind of embrace that only existed between people who had been through the specific collection of things they had been through, not the social performance of warmth, but the actual thing, two people using the only language that fully carried what they meant. Brian, Dom said. Yeah, thank you for coming back around. Brian stepped back. He looked at his friend, his brother by the only definition that had ever mattered. Always, he said. One word, the word they had built everything on. They drove back to the house. The crew was still in the backyard, lights strung between the trees, the grill cooling, music playing from somewhere warm and close. Han was there talking to Jacob about something that required his hands to explain, both of them leaning against the fence with the ease of people who had found unexpected common ground. Tej and Roman were in the middle of an argument about something technical that neither of them would concede without at least 45 more minutes of supporting evidence. Letty was on the back steps with her arms around her knees, watching everything, carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who had survived enough to know exactly what she was looking at. Mia was in the doorway with Jack on her hip, the light from the house behind her, watching the driveway as they pulled in. She had been waiting, not anxiously, the way a person waited when they knew the people they were waiting for were coming back. The two cars pulled into the driveway side by side. The engines went quiet. And the Toretto house, which had been the center of all of it since the very beginning, the place where the family came back to, the place the fights were fought for, the place that had survived every attempt the world had made to reduce it to something less than what it was, received them. Dom stood in the driveway for a moment before going inside. He looked at the backyard, at all of them, at Han, who had been lost and was found, at Jakob, who had been exiled and was home, at Roman, who had become himself, at Tej and Letty and Ramsey and all of them. This family that had been built from nothing but choice and maintained by nothing but showing up. He looked at Brian standing beside him. He thought about his father, about the hand on his shoulder in 1989, and the words, "Some things you have to race through, mijo," and what it had taken him a lifetime to fully understand. That you raced through the hard things not because the destination was guaranteed. You raced through them because the people beside you needed to know you were still moving. He picked up the glass he had carried outside, raised it, quietly, to nobody in particular, to the night, to the lights, to all of it. Some people live their lives a quarter mile at a time, he said, under his breath, to the backyard and the family and the October sky above Los Angeles. We lived ours, one battle at a time, a pause, and we won every one. He went inside. The music played. The lights held. And the family stayed. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end.